it's really wonderful to have you here. With Saada, it has been a few years that we've been trying to figure out what is going on with democracy, what might be wrong with democracy, maybe. And we are trying to, it's like a new catastrophe each year, really. It's like we see that something new is wrong, so we are trying to work on it with this workshop each year. So last year, well, the wrong thing was obvious. It was the war in Ukraine, which we hoped that was going to be over for our current event, and unfortunately not. Yet, as you have seen for the last few months, we have all been struck by the movement against new judicial reforms in many countries. So we have been impressed by the protest in Israel. I'm not going. You have seen some pictures from this protest. I'm going to put them back at some point. But there is something weird that we are living through. There is a weird moment that is ours, namely the end of the expansion of democratic regimes. Right. So this is the current situation. How this situation is being dealt with by the law. What does it mean to make legal advances today? Should we do it on the national level or on the international level? These are all the questions that I would like to ask today. But so yes, our initial, as you have seen probably in the presentation, our initial idea was that still today, in particular, recently, in particular in new democracies, legal reforms were associated with liberal democracy. Right now, legal reforms are associated to something else, to a quest for maybe something authoritarian, maybe something. Well, we'll have discussion about what these people are looking for. A few years ago, like 30 years ago, and this is something that really motivates my recent readings. The discussions about legal reforms in Eastern Europe and in Latin America were associated to worries about the economical consequences of radical legal and state reforms. Right now, these worries are not very present in our context. Something else is going on. So I think that we have a intellectual duty to grasp this issue. Volume, please. I have no idea where I could put up the volume. Yeah, but for the entering, you don't see. I still don't. Yeah. Okay, Francesca, is it better or not? Okay, wonderful. So I'll just keep this volume. So I'm done. I'm not going to go further. As usual, I have 30 slides for the introduction. So, this is, okay, this last slide, which is quite funny, if you don't mind. This last slide is about the distribution of electoral democracy in various countries. So there are some random countries plus the countries of our interest. Just trying to, yeah, whatever. This, let's take it out. Okay. Sorry? I tried, but what do I do with this? Annuler or fermer? Fermer? Okay, so the countries we are interested in are Turkey for this morning, Hungary, Poland. Poland is worse than Kosovo, apparently, from the point of view of democracy, which is crazy. Italy is much better, and then you have more countries. Okay, so we'll come back to these numbers and to these schemas very soon. As for now, I'm just going to stop sharing the screen. And who feels like starting? I think that we could maybe start with Eric, talking about Turkey, if you don't mind, and then we would just go farther towards Eastern Europe. All right. I'm gone again. I'm being told.
No, it's okay. No, it's okay.
Now it's okay. Wonderful. Okay, so Eric, what do you think about starting?
Oui, avec plaisir. Il n'y a pas de problème de mon côté, si ça ne dérange pas mes collègues.
Wonderful. Let's go then.
Bien, je commence donc.
Yes.
Merci beaucoup. Merci aux organisateurs de m'avoir invité à ce séminaire et c'est un plaisir pour moi que d'être parmi vous. Alors, il m'a été...
Sorry, just one tiny thing. I'm afraid that people might not understand what you are saying in French. There are some people online in particular who just don't speak French. Is it doable to do it in English or it's tricky? No, it's tricky. Okay. So what I'll do, I'll try to translate you live in the chat then. Okay, let's go.
Là, je suis désolé, j'avais pas l'information. Et puis mon anglais n'est pas de très bon niveau. Donc, vous souhaitez traduire en simultané, c'est ça?
Okay, I'll just put some notes in the chat, okay? While you are talking. So don't look at the chat. It will be just me talking to people and trying to say what you are saying. So don't worry. Just go on and all good.
D'accord. Bah, écoutez, je vais essayer d'aller doucement, en tout cas plus lentement que prévu. Donc, il m'a été demandé d'évoquer les réformes illibérales de la justice en Turquie. Alors, j'aurais tendance à vous dire d'abord que le pluriel, malheureusement, est justifié parce qu'il y a plusieurs changements qui ont été orchestrés, et notamment depuis la révision constitutionnelle de 2010, révision qui traduit une certaine reprise en main politique de la Cour constitutionnelle d'abord et ensuite du Haut Conseil des juges et des procureurs. Illibérales, sans doute, ces réformes le sont, en tout cas celle de 2010, dans la mesure où elle vient porter atteinte à l'indépendance de la justice, avec un objectif global qui est de réduire, dans un premier temps, toute forme de contre-pouvoir et avec le sentiment qu'on peut avoir d'une autre volonté qui serait celle d'éliminer totalement toute forme d'opposition. Alors, le contexte de cette réforme de 2010, à mon avis, il est important à rappeler, puisque cette réforme, elle vient jeter, j'aurais tendance à dire, un voile politique sur la justice et avec pour point de départ la question sensible du port du foulard dans les universités en Turquie. L'AKP, qui est au pouvoir à l'époque, veut modifier la Constitution en 2008 afin de permettre le port du foulard dans les universités. Et à ce moment-là, le Conseil d'État turc et la Cour de cassation turque vont publiquement faire savoir leur opposition à cette réforme par le biais de communiqués de presse. Cour de cassation et Conseil d'État qui soulignent que cette révision, elle méconnaît en réalité les interdictions jurisprudentielles à ce sujet au nom du principe constitutionnel de laïcité. Donc, ces deux cours supérieures ont fait savoir leur opposition à ce projet en rappelant l'état du droit en la matière et en soulignant aussi le nécessaire respect des décisions de justice. Il faut souligner aussi qu'à la même époque, en 2008, et il y a un lien très étroit avec ce que je viens de vous expliquer, à la même époque, le procureur général près la Cour de cassation de Turquie a lancé une procédure auprès de la Cour constitutionnelle pour demander, ce qui est inédit, la dissolution de l'AKP. c'est-à-dire le parti de Recep Tayyip Erdogan. En réaction à cette révision constitutionnelle qui a fait l'objet de contestations de la part de ces juges, eh bien, il y a une révision de 2010 qui va être programmée et qui a pour but de réduire de façon assez importante la place occupée par la Cour de cassation et le Conseil d'État dans le Haut Conseil des juges et des procureurs de Turquie. Du côté de la Cour constitutionnelle, en 2008, le contexte est particulier aussi, puisqu'elle a eu l'audace de censurer le fameux amendement constitutionnel porté par l'AKP qui avait pour objectif de permettre le port du voile dans les universités. Et elle l'a fait au nom du principe constitutionnel de laïcité. Alors, audace, parce que la Constitution ne lui donne pas le pouvoir de contrôler les révisions constitutionnelles sur le fond. Elle n'a qu'un pouvoir de contrôle formel. Mais là, en 2008, la Cour est allée au-delà de ses compétences en exerçant un véritable contrôle matériel des amendements constitutionnels et, en l'espèce, en le censurant pour méconnaissance du principe de laïcité. La Cour a eu une formule intéressante, elle a dit que un projet de loi constitutionnelle formellement valide ne pouvait pas pour autant être proposable dès lors qu'il portait atteinte au principe dont la révision constitutionnelle est interdite. Ce sont les 3 premiers articles de la Constitution qui sont concernés en vertu de l'article 4. Et le principe de laïcité est dans l'article 2. Donc une audace de la Cour constitutionnelle qui s'oppose frontalement au pouvoir politique sur cette question sensible du port du voile. Et toujours en 2008, après avoir invalidé la révision constitutionnelle dont je vous parle, il est également de revenir sur cette situation inédite, c'est-à-dire la demande de dissolution de l'AKP qui a été formulée par le procureur général près la Cour de cassation que j'évoquais tout à l'heure. Et les juges constitutionnels, dans cette affaire, alors sans doute conscients des conséquences politiques de leur décision en la matière, et puis ayant préservé l'essentiel en censurant l'amendement constitutionnel dont je viens de vous parler, ont simplement adressé un avertissement à l'AKP. Ils n'ont pas prononcé sa dissolution, mais avertissement somme toute assez symbolique, puisqu'il y a eu une sanction, la réduction de moitié des subventions publiques allouées à ce parti politique. Eh bien, toujours en réaction, la révision constitutionnelle de 2010 vient changer les modalités de désignation des membres de la Cour constitutionnelle en permettant au président de la République et à sa majorité parlementaire d'en maîtriser quelque part de façon importante la composition. Donc cette réforme constitutionnelle de 2010, si je devais la résumer, c'est une réforme sanction. C'est une réforme vengeance, entre guillemets, pour les 2 expressions, qui sont utilisées par de nombreux constitutionnalistes en Turquie. Réforme constitutionnelle pour viser directement l'appareil judiciaire dans son ensemble, mais particulièrement le Haut Conseil des juges et des procureurs d'une part, et la Cour constitutionnelle d'autre part. Donc le sujet qu'on m'a demandé de traiter est plutôt large, mais je vais le réduire à cet aspect-là en vous exposant le contenu et les modalités de cette réforme de 2010 et en vous disant quelques mots sur ses conséquences. Et ensuite, je conclurai avec une situation un peu plus récentes. Le contenu et les modalités de la réforme constitutionnelle de 2010 d'abord, il y avait deux paquets dans cette réforme. Et pour dire les choses peut-être un peu brutalement, il y avait un paquet libéral, progressiste, et il y avait un autre paquet qui l'était moins. Alors, du côté du paquet libéral, je ne vais pas être trop long, mais je pourrais répondre à des questions sur ce sujet-là, bien évidemment. Il y a tout un volet qui concerne l'amélioration des droits et libertés. La recherche d'une meilleure égalité entre les hommes et les femmes, une amélioration de la protection des enfants, l'amélioration des droits sociaux des fonctionnaires, la création d'un médiateur permettant d'arbitrer les conflits entre les citoyens et l'administration. Bref, autant d'avancées constitutionnelles assez importantes qui témoignent dans une certaine mesure des efforts poursuivis par la Turquie pour respecter les conditions nécessaires à sa future entrée dans l'Union européenne à l'époque. Et puis, il y a un autre volet. Quand on enlève le vernis que je viens de décrire rapidement, il y a un autre volet qui est beaucoup moins libéral, qui est beaucoup moins progressiste et qui concerne le Conseil supérieur des juges et des procureurs et la Cour constitutionnelle. Alors, pour le Conseil supérieur des juges et des procureurs, je ne vais pas rentrer dans le détail des compositions parce que ça pourrait être compliqué et fastidieux. Sachez simplement qu'avant la réforme de 2010, ce conseil-là, qui est important pour l'indépendance de la magistrature en Turquie, bien évidemment, ce conseil était essentiellement composé de juges issus de la Cour de cassation et du Conseil d'État. Mais comme les deux étaient dans le viseur de l'AKP, pour les raisons que j'ai évoquées, eh bien, cette composition, elle est revue afin de noyer la Cour de cassation et le Conseil d'État dans un ensemble beaucoup plus large et pour réduire leur champ d'influence. Par exemple, ce Conseil qui contenait 7 membres au départ, eh bien, est composé de 22 en 2010 et 22 membres au sein desquels il y en a 10 qui sont issus des juridictions de premier degré, dont on dit en Turquie, en tout cas dont les observateurs ont souligné une certaine proximité avec le pouvoir. Il y a le ministre de la Justice qui assure la présidence, il y a le sous-secrétaire d'État à la justice qui est là également. Et si on n'a pas touché à l'effectif des juges issus de la Cour de cassation et du Conseil d'État, ils sont là dans le même nombre que précédemment, ils ne sont plus dominants. Ça, c'est l'aspect important de la réforme, présentée, je le rappelle, comme une réforme sanction. Du côté de la Cour constitutionnelle, alors je rentrerai un peu plus dans le détail parce que ça relève de ma spécialité plus directement. On va retrouver 17 juges dans la Cour constitutionnelle nouvelle, recomposée, et il y en a 14 qui vont être nommés par le président de la République et 3 élus par le Parlement. Et sur les 14 qui sont nommés par le président de la République, il va en choisir 4 directement. 4 directement, et les 10 autres sont choisis indirectement, sur la base de propositions qui sont faites par d'autres institutions. Mais j'appellerai votre attention sur les 4 qui sont nommés directement par le président et sur les 3 qui sont élus par le Parlement. Retenez ce chiffre, s'il vous plaît, 7. 7 juges au minimum, qui vont pouvoir en fait être quelque part choisis et maîtrisés par le pouvoir politique en place. Un calcul assez simple, me semble-t-il, permet de comprendre le changement qui est à l'œuvre. Dans certaines de ces décisions, la Cour constitutionnelle turque doit décider à la majorité qualifiée des 2/3. Alors, quelles décisions sont importantes, celles-là? Et ça va me permettre de revenir au contexte. Majorité qualifiée des 2/3, c'est-à-dire 11 juges sur 17, requises pour examiner les amendements constitutionnels. 11 juges sur 17, majorité qualifiée requise aussi, pour prononcer la dissolution des partis politiques et pour leur adresser des sanctions. Si on retient ce que je vous disais tout à l'heure, au moins 7 juges choisis par la majorité politique du moment, vous voyez que 17 moins 7, ça fait 10. Et donc, on ne peut pas arriver à la majorité qualifiée que je viens de vous expliquer pour examiner et décider du contrôle de constitutionnalité des lois de révision et pour se prononcer sur la dissolution des partis. Donc, ce n'est pas une reprise en main grossière de la Cour constitutionnelle. Le pouvoir politique ne veut pas mettre la main sur la totalité des juges. Il y a un calcul qui a été fait, mais qui s'avère quand même assez efficace dans la stratégie qui est poursuivie. Donc, il ne s'agit pas de maîtriser tous les juges, mais de s'assurer que la justice constitutionnelle ne présentera plus un facteur de blocage pour l'AKP dans les réformes constitutionnelles qu'elle envisage, mais aussi pour le parti politique lui-même, parce que, je le rappelle, l'AKP a fait l'objet d'une demande de dissolution, ce qui est inédit en Turquie pour un parti politique qui est au pouvoir. À l'époque, les constitutionnalistes qui se sont exprimés sur ce sujet se sont demandé, à titre légitime, il me semble, si la Cour n'était pas simplement transformée en une sorte de conseil gouvernemental. Sur les modalités de la réforme, pour terminer ce premier point rapidement, il faut savoir qu'elle a été soumise au peuple. Elle a été soumise au peuple par référendum et finalement, le conflit politico-juridictionnel qui a existé entre l'AKP et les juges, et notamment la Cour constitutionnelle et le Haut Conseil, eh bien, ce conflit, il a été tranché par les citoyens. En tout cas, on leur a demandé, le pouvoir politique leur a demandé d'arbitrer cela. Et bien évidemment, dans ce référendum, les citoyens ne pouvaient pas choisir telle ou telle partie de la réforme. Et ils se sont arrêtés sur quoi, les citoyens turcs? Sur les nouveaux droits et libertés qui leur étaient reconnus, sur le premier volet. Ils se sont beaucoup moins intéressés sur l'autre volet du paquet qui consistait à reprendre en main le pouvoir judiciaire. Donc, le peuple a été sollicité pour valider en bloc un paquet constitutionnel qui lui octroyait de nouveaux droits, mais qui assurait surtout par ailleurs l'encadrement politique des juges constitutionnels et des juges ordinaires. Alors, au niveau des conséquences de la réforme constitutionnelle de 2010, il y a 2 points que l'on peut retenir principalement. Il y a d'abord des conséquences ciblées par rapport au contexte de départ, et puis je pense qu'il y a des conséquences un peu plus générales. À la suite de cette révision, il est possible de constater assez rapidement un changement plutôt radical dans la jurisprudence de la Cour constitutionnelle en ce qui concerne le principe constitutionnel de laïcité. La Cour, depuis longtemps, défendait ce principe et interdisait notamment le port du voile dans les universités. Et elle est même allée jusqu'à censurer une loi de révision qui avait pour vocation de surmonter cette jurisprudence. Donc, comme l'AKP n'a pas réussi a avancé sensiblement sur cette affaire du voile par la révision de la Constitution qui a été bloquée par les juges, eh bien, ils ont décidé de changer les juges, ce que je vous ai expliqué. Pour espérer un changement dans la jurisprudence, qui intervient le 25 juin 2014 dans le cadre d'un recours individuel devant la Cour constitutionnelle. Et là, on a un considérant de principe dans cette décision qui permet de comprendre qu'il y a eu un revirement jurisprudentiel important. Toute limitation relative à un lieu déterminé ou à un type de vêtements concerné constitue une atteinte à la liberté de religion, dira la Cour constitutionnelle. Toute limitation de lieu ou de forme de vêtements concernés est attentatoire à la liberté de religion. Donc, ce considérant assez général permet de couvrir de nombreux cas. Et en 2015, le Conseil supérieur des juges et des procureurs a considéré, quant à lui, qu'il n'existait aucune interdiction concernant le port du voile par les juges du siège et par les membres du parquet. Alors ça, c'est vraiment par rapport au contexte de départ que j'évoquais.
Cher Eric, il va falloir conclure.
Oui, j'y arrive. Les conséquences plus générales, eh bien, elles sont dans le fait que cette révision 2010, finalement, c'est un petit peu un prélude à d'autres révisions qui interviendront plus tard, et notamment à 2017. Puisqu'on va retoucher encore une fois à la composition de ces deux institutions que j'ai évoquées dans mes propos, Cour constitutionnelle et Haut Conseil des juges et des procureurs. Et entre ces deux réformes, je terminerai par là, il y a tout ce qui s'est passé en 2016, à la suite du coup d'État raté. Alors, je n'ai pas fait le cœur de mon propos, parce qu'on ne peut pas parler d'une réforme à ce moment-là, c'est plutôt un raz-de-marée. C'est un raz-de-marée qui va frapper de plein fouet le monde judiciaire en particulier, mais d'autres institutions aussi. Vous savez qu'il y a eu une purge massive orchestrée par le pouvoir politique, prétexte de poursuivre les auteurs de ce coup d'État et leurs complices. En réalité, cette purge massive, elle a permis au pouvoir politique en place de faire un grand nettoyage en visant des opposants, en visant aussi des dissidents et des personnes qui, de près ou de loin, ont fait savoir leur distance avec le régime. Donc, purge dans l'armée, dans la police, dans l'administration, dans les universités, chez les avocats, les journalistes, et surtout dans la magistrature. C'est peut-être le volet le moins connu. Sachez quand même que sur 15 000 magistrats à l'époque, il y en a plus de 4 500 qui ont été révoqués par décret. 4 500 qui ont été révoqués par décret, et sur ces 4 500, il y en a près de 2 500 qui ont été arrêtés. Alors, pour des motifs qui ont été bien évidemment discutés et pour motif principal d'adhésion à des groupes armés terroristes. Et par la suite, il y a de nouveaux juges qui ont été recrutés dans un temps record avec des critères de recrutement qui sont douteux, en tout cas qui ont été mis en cause, et près de 11 000 nouveaux juges qui ont été ainsi accrédités dans la précipitation. Voilà, je ne veux pas exagérer, mais j'aurais tendance à vous dire, en empruntant des mots à Jean-Paul Costa, que sans juridiction indépendante et impartiale, eh bien, la garantie de tous les autres droits de l'homme est bien évidemment illusoire, et l'état de droit lui-même devient une fiction sans substance. Je vous remercie, je reste à votre disposition pour répondre éventuellement à vos questions.
Thank you so much, Eric. It was absolutely fascinating and very clear. I mean, clear enough to make me able to write it down. I hope that people did understand it online. Those of you who don't speak French, and you finished with a wonderful phrase saying that without the independent judiciary, we are not able to have a proper democracy and human rights, because this is where it starts. So bravo Erdogan in a way, because you showed how fine it was. I mean, you said that it was not it was not a straightforward destruction of the judiciary. It was made step by step in a way that that was quite impressive from the somehow evil elegance point of view, right? This is something that the Polish judiciary is also doing. I don't know whether Anna or Zoltán would like to make a sinister follow-up of this discussion. Maybe Zoltán, I mean, since Poland was in the news, all over the news quite recently for that reasons, maybe let's go for Hungary first, and we will finish with Poland, and it's going to be a very nice way to go towards Israel, that is in a constant dialogue with Poland as far as the demonstrations are concerned. And this is wonderful. Zoltán, if you would like to take some space, that would be great.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm really very happy being here. So the legal reform, judiciary, and Hungary have a peculiar connections today, and it's really very interesting. But my question here is, what is really important for understanding authoritarian legalism, and whether the legal reform, the formal reform, is important or not, or there are other factors which are much more essential for understanding authoritarian legalism, because this kind of non-democracy is, as you know, quite peculiar and quite different than the traditional or classic authoritarian systems till or until the modern history of Europe or the world. So what is important for the Hungarian lesson is quite informative on the question of the relative importance of structural, organizational, or administrative issues, because the institutional environment, historical background, historical traditions, or even social and political integration of the so-called legal complex, the other legal professionals, the attitudes of legal professionals, and the culture of autonomy are much more important factors to understand judicial independence. But there's a long history of the judicial independence in Hungary, but this long history starts in the 19th century, the very end of the 19th century, which is a so-called late development of autonomy and constitutional state, and a very low level of parliamentarism and democracy. So in Hungary, there is no strong tradition of autonomy and judicial independence before the World War II. And of course, the socialist period is also quite traumatic from the perspective of independence and autonomy, as you know, because it's based on the unified system of power. But the last two decades of the socialist period, the so-called soft dictatorship or soft authoritarian cadreism, was a place for the judges to build a relative autonomy, an individual autonomy under the surface of the socialist ideology. So there are some there were some very important individual measures or tools to defend the individual status of judges, not collective defense against the power of the state and the party, but individual judges could feel some kind of autonomy. It is important because today our most important problem is how to construct a collective self-defense of autonomy and independence against the new authoritarian state. And our problem is that comparing to the Polish situation, the Hungarian judges are seriously disintegrated, and they know only individual self-help and shields against some pressures, but the collective resilience is completely missing. But as concerning the legal reform, after the system change, after the breakdown of the communist regime, there was a long hesitation on the administrative model of judiciary until the very middle of the 90s. The new system of the new council system was set up in 97, which means that the first some years after the system change were full of conflicts between the government and the judiciary, because that was a so-called ministerial administration. So the justice minister had the authorities to nominate the court presidents, the county court presidents. The middle-level administration traditionally is a very important level of administration, because during the socialism, the county level, the middle level, it was politically and administratively the strongest part of the judicial administration. And the second period of the reform, or the democratic reform, was the so-called the council model. And from the middle of the 90s, the Hungarian Judicial Council was a strong institution, but with some serious mistakes, because the parliament made a very big mistake administratively, because the composition of the council was not really autonomous, because the so-called middle-level administration, the presidents of the county courts, could be selected for the members of the council, which means that the traditionally strong part of the administration was inside the council, and the judiciary was prone to select the old presidents for the council, which means that the council, which officially control and guide the administration of the judiciary, were full of the middle-level administrators. So that was an oligarchic council, a suboptimal council with a very low administrative efficiency. And after 2010, with 2/3 majority in the parliament, the Orban government changed this system. But what was interesting is that they kept the council model formally, but the new government after 2010 did two quite simple things. So the one is to change the composition of the slow change of the composition of the Constitutional Court. So with 2/3 majority in the parliament, the new government was quite succeeded to quite strongly thought that the most important element of the constitutional state is the Constitutional Court, because after the system change, the German model was impressive for the Hungarian reformers. So the Constitutional Court is a strong institution in the Hungarian public law, and the Orbán government decided to change the constitutional judges slowly but quite openly for political friends. The second thing was to change the administration of the ordinary court, the ordinary judges, but keep the council model quite interestingly, because the most important administrative element in the judiciary, the judicial administration, is not the council itself, but the president of the office behind the council, because the council members are elected by the judiciary directly, but the president of the office is elected by the parliament with 2/3 majority, which means that the president of the office, who is an administrator, a judge administrator, is the most important and most powerful administrative element of the judiciary. And of course, it's a question of authorities. The division of labor among the council and the president. But it turned out that the president has the whole authority of the former council model before 2010, which means that nominating, selecting the administrative leaders of judiciary, the promotion of judges, and other relatively important authorities above the judicial life and work was in the hands of the president of the office. And officially, the council has the formal right to control the work and functioning of the president of the office, but in reality, the council has not enough power to do this, because administratively it is a very weak body without budget, without competence, without even an office place. So the judiciary has a weak council and a very strong administrator, a president elected by the parliament. So this is a political channel, which means that it's a quite unique model, because formally it's a council model, but in reality it's not a council model, it's a political model, because a judge who was elected by the parliament has the full authority for administering judiciary. And by the way, this person was firstly the very close friend of the prime minister. And something happened in the next round, the next council in 2017 was a very strong and reform-minded, radical composition of the council. So the judiciary elected some good young revolutionary members of the council, but the council remained weak, and a quite strong and fierce conflict emerged between the president of the office and the council, because of the weak council could not tolerate the political pressures and the working of the political channels through the president of the office. And now we are in a situation where there's a weak council backed by the European Union, because the European Union critics about the Hungarian rule of law system is concentrating on the judicial autonomy, and they realize that the council is not strong enough and try to defend the original idea of the council model, that it is a self-autonomous administration by the judges, by the elected members of the council, and the European Union tried to defend the autonomies of the council, but the legal environment is quite detrimental for the autonomy of the judiciary, because without an autonomous and free constitutional judiciary, an ombudsman, a free press, and pluralist media, there's no chance to defend the judicial autonomy. So we have a council with a critical voice, but I consulted the members of the council now, and they have some fears for the future, because the end of this year, there will be a new election of the council, and they are very pessimistic about the future of the council because of the political and legal environment of Hungary. Because despite the harsh and quite honest European institutional critics and political reproachment against the Hungarian rule of law system and dismantling, the judiciary feels that there's no other option just to accept the authoritarian government, because all the monies, all the financing, all the administrative issues, and all the very important environment of the judicial work are coming from the government. There's no political alternatives of the present government. The best thing to accept the present situation, which means that they will elect those judges for the membership of the council who are much more conform than the present members of the council, because they see that the present situation, the conflicted situation between the council and the government is not financially is not an advantage for the judiciary. So there's a very peculiar situation now where the reform is a kind of idea which now is coming from the European Union, but as we know, after 2010, the reform was set as a new building of the authoritarian system. The first element, which you must know, the so-called Baka case issue, which means that the government and the new two-thirds parliamentary majority simply dismissed the president of the Supreme Court illegally and unconstitutionally, and they accepted a new constitution, the so-called fundamental law, which is full of ideological elements, but kept formally the council model. But this is quite a good example for the so-called facade rule of law, which means that formally is a council system, but in reality is a very weak autonomy and independence for judges. So the history, the tradition system among judiciary, the so-called autocratic legalism, and the political environment of judiciary is quite depressing now in Hungary. The Hungarian Democrats are fearing about the so-called reforms, because administrative reforms are only forms. So without wholesale political change, there's no chance to defend the judicial autonomy. So there is a surface which is quite dangerous for the real functioning of the autonomy.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Zoltán, for this not very optimistic indeed perspective.
I think that there are two common ideas that has to do with, first, the cases. I think that proves this idea of Wendy Brown, that unlike liberalism, neoliberalism has something against democracy, and that process in which neoliberalism erodes the democracy, the institution of democracies, and in particular the rule of law. And I think another thing that it is interesting to consider is the legacy of authoritarianism in the present, how it remains in the present, and how the juridical powers act as a conservative force in democracies. And I would like to bring to the table the case of Latin American, and in particular the case of the Southern Corn, because in Latin American we have a problem that is maybe different in some point, that has to be that with the juridical power being a conservative force that can conditionate democracy. And I would like to mention the case of Brazil, for example, in which the condemnation of Lula da Silva was then, well, a strong limit to democracy, and Argentina is like facing a very similar problem. We have a Supreme Court that has only 4 members, all of them are men, none of them are, there's no woman on the composition of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is being like super conservative, and the powers of democracy, the legislative power and the executive power that are not able to take like democratizing measures. So my question is that what type of juridical reforms do we need to construct a proper check and balances system in the present, considering all the difficulties that we are facing in general?
And you do hope that that you will get a response that works for everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, of course. Thanks so much. Please, quick responses. Okay, maybe let's start. Does anyone have an idea? Please go.
Yeah, can I start with some very short answer to neoliberalism, which is not only an economic program or economic and political background of the system change during the post-communist reforms in the 90s. So it was a quite big historical a mistake or a historical trick that the advanced neoliberalism was the same period that the system change in the post-communist countries. But for us, dealing with legal reforms, the neoliberalism means a kind of liberal formalism, which means that there was a huge and still living institutional optimism, which means that the former liberal institutions are enough for developing rule of law country, which means that setting up a constitutional court or declaring judicial independence in the constitutions are enough guarantees to defend the constitutional system and constitutional rule of law and democracy. And after 2 decades, it turned out that the social infrastructure, the cultural background was not developed enough for accepting rule of law and constitutional values, and even the common European values are in danger in Hungary as an accepted social value system. So there is a huge disappointment in Hungary about the rule of law values, because in the everyday life, there's no any consequence of the liberal formalism, which means that not the neoliberal economic program itself, but this kind of liberal legal formalism, which was a trap for the rule of law values and constitutional development. So, of course, historical traditions and path dependencies are a good models for understanding the new despotism in Hungary and post-communist countries. But I can not say any other things that the prosperous future reform, which is also asked us, can or must concentrate on the social infrastructure, the social equality, and the social program for accepting rule of law values in the everyday life, which means much more involvement of people and different social forces to accept rule of law values. So, the rule of law is a democratic problem, not a formal legal problem.
Thanks so much. This is absolutely fascinating, and I think that this is something that could be. Yeah, please go on, Anna, and I will just add something later if you would like to add something, or all is good. No, all is good. Okay, so if we can stop with this question, if we can go to another question that I see online. We have 2 other questions, so this is why I'm speeding. There's Itai, but I don't know whether people. What do you hope for? I mean, thanks for very interesting and illuminating presentations. My question to the 3 panelists based on the successful and unsuccessful efforts in the 3 jurisdictions, what advice would you give to Israeli protesters? Just okay. So this is Itai, and thank you so much. But Itai, I just hope that you are going to answer this question yourself, right? Or you will. Anyway, I'm not inviting anyone to deal with this right now. We'll come back to this fundamental question in a few minutes. Pascal, please go on.
Bonjour, alors merci à tous et à toutes pour vos présentations. Donc, Pascal Midouga, j'enseigne à Ottawa au Canada. Alors, il me semble que dans les présentations qu'on a entendues... Okay, I was going to switch back and forth, which is something that I usually do in my own country where French and English is. But I can submit to the hegemony of the English language right up front, if that's deemed better by you and by the others. So we've heard accounts where the judicial power basically crumbles in the face of autocracy, right? And I was just thinking, I haven't heard from people any word about institutional innovations within kind of the judicial system and the system of rights, let's say more broadly, that could increase the resilience of that system in the face of autocracy, right? So popular constitutionalism is a phrase that was kind of in vogue 20 years ago, right? Involving social movements in constitutional lawmaking. We could imagine many ways in which this could be done to sort of resist authoritarianism more effectively than just through juristocracy. If you're into social law and labor law like I am and interested in social rights, that's obviously a very congenial idea, but that's not really what we're talking about here. So, but I'm just wondering, for you constitutional law scholars, which I am not, is that idea on the map anywhere? And another example, in closing, just another example of an institutional innovation would be fragmenting the judicial power, right? So, for instance, in Canada, where I'm from, human rights have separate, right? There's specialized courts dealing mostly with equality and anti-discrimination rights, but also kind of civil and political rights more broadly. Every province has one. These courts validate legislation. They're subject to judicial review by the real courts, but they're, and by the way, in Anglo-Saxon systems, there's not only one court that you need to defeat if you're an autocrat, because all courts, including those of first instance, adjudicate constitutional rights. So we don't have this idea of centralizing all the judicial power in one body, which is the apex court, because all of the courts across the system have the power to enforce rights in the face, let's say, of autocracy. So I'm just wondering about institutional innovations like that, and if any of you have thoughts about whether that should be on the agenda going forward. But thank you, everyone, for your presentation.
Please, go on, Anna, please.
Can I speak here?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. I didn't understand if it's me. So I would say my advice to the Israeli protesters is that please do endure in your protests. I remember that moment, but also translate to the people and the wide public that the protests are in the interest of the very each individual, no matter what is his or her current understanding of the aim of the protest, of the scale of the devastation, of the proposed reforms, etc. I remember a moment where there were planned reforms on the organization of the Constitutional Tribunal that would again make its functioning impossible or fully subordinated to the, again, political leadership because of the changes in the composition of the chambers, the changes how they should be, how they should vote, etc. And these attacks on the constitutional tribunals did not attract too much of the street protesters, and then Ombudsman's office published a list of, I would say, 10 decisions that were most important for the protection of human rights, individual rights, kind of reminding that the Constitutional Tribunal has been there for the people all the time. But I would say this understanding that the Constitutional Tribunal has been there for the people has not been very deeply established, because I would understand, or I would say that the understanding was that the Constitutional Tribunal is there for constitutionality of the law, so to uphold the system of constitutionality of the laws rather than serve the people. And this political capture, this anti-elitist populist movements that destroyed the rule of law in Poland, they had an easy job, because there was a part of the society that was pretty much frustrated with the liberal reforms, that it was easy to turn basically the emotions or the sentiments against the past opposition, but still the democratic opposition who now tries to win the elections, but also against the post-communist elites that, in the common understanding, have took advantage of the economic liberal reforms. So I would say this, again, populist manipulations of the crowd, but then there is still some reasonable people out there. So translating today, again, sense of what's going on, that they should, these institutions, in the end, they serve individuals, but also making the institutions communicate better with the individuals, and kind of taking care of their own authority in terms of social authority. So I would say foreign models and restructuring the models do not make that much sense as long as the society does not see the courts as part of us. And I stop here.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. I don't think that the Pascal's questions has been really treated. Does anyone, Zoltán or Eric, would you like to respond to Pascal's point?
Just very, very short, because it's very interesting. My problem is that concerning the innovations, the Fidesz and the Orban government is very innovative to use new institutional solutions. So for judges, there is only one working channel for defending themselves. It is the so-called European preliminary rulings system, which means that there's a kind of mutual communication between different judiciaries inside Europe, the European judiciary, the member state judiciary, and the Hungarian and Polish judiciaries. So a kind of, so there's a lack of inside communication between different legal professionals, because the bar could not defend the judicial independence, but the European judges can defend the Hungarian judiciary. So there's a mutual learning from each other. So that is the only channel, a new channel.
Okay, wonderful. There's one question in the room, but before inviting you here, because you'll have to come here, we just have to announce that there will be no proper break. We'll have no time to do that. So if you need to go out for some reason, please do right now during the question session, because we are going to start at 11:05 or something like that. The Israeli session. So you're very much invited here. Awesome. Wonderful.
Yeah. So hi, I wanted to respond to Pascal because I'm from Turkey, but I'm doing my PhD in Canada. So so what I wanted to say in terms of I think it's important to realize that it's that the power of autocrats, especially in the context of Turkey, is much more than we think. They actually are so much in control that they even control who they appoint to specific criminal courts for shoving these cases. So even in a case of in the case of Canada, for example, setting up a human rights tribunal specifically, etc. First, they will be flooded by judges who are for the government. And two, for example, in the Turkish case, there's a possibility of doing a conventionality control for even every judge. But these, even when a lower court judge actually says this particular law is contrary to the European Convention, so I'm going to just apply the convention, those decisions are overturned by the Supreme Court. So in the case when you put the right judges in the right places, you end up having the same result anyway. And finally, in the context of popular constitutionalism, that is also that has also been discussed in many cases, but that is also sometimes instrumentalized by these autocrats. It has been the case, for example, in Venezuela, they set up a great constitutive assembly. It seems to be a perfect popular constitutionalism case, but in the end, even the way you choose the electoral system to elect that constituent assembly matters. So in the case, it all comes back to what Professor Simon has been saying, actually, the idea of how do you construct the idea of rule of law and democracy in the first place against this, against rising authoritarianism. So thank you.
Okay, wonderful. This is very interesting. So the last remark, yeah, Guillaume, so you're very much invited here. But while you are sitting, I'm just going to say that the remark about Brazil was very, very interesting too, in the sense that I think that what happened in Brazil, in Latin America and in America and in Eastern Europe with neoliberalism, you're absolutely right. We insist on the negative consequences of neoliberalism from an economical point of view, which is true. But it is in the first place an ideology that says that we don't need a state. So the state has been, destroyed also. So the interest for the judiciary, for its importance has been, weakened by neoliberalism, not as an economic, but as a political stance. So thanks for this remarks.
So thank you to all the conveners. I would like to connect what I've heard from Turkey and what I've heard from Hungary. And my question is especially related to what Eric, you said about the reform of the High Council of the Judiciary and Prosecutors. And I would like to connect what you said about the institutional framework, the institutional change with which we are obsessed as lawyers, and the sociology of the legal profession and the sociology of the judiciary. And my question is whether the reform of the High Council of the Judiciary was related to the fact that there is a vast majority of the members of the judiciary are connected to the Gülen group, and this was important at the time when the reform was made for the for the capture of power by the AKP. So, and I think as lawyers we have some limits to understand this kind of processes because we understand the technicalities of the reforms, we understand the sophistication of this reform, and you pointed at the reform of the majority for making this specific kind of decision, etc., etc. So this we understand quite well, but we have to connect with the sociology of the professions, the sociology of the lawyers, the jurists, the prosecutors, and there may very well be conflicting legal cultures within the legal professionals. So maybe a constitutional judge does not have exactly the same culture as a prosecutor, as a member of the judiciary, as a member of the higher strengths in the hierarchy of the judiciary, the lower strengths, etc., etc. So how do you, is this connection, is it meaningful in order to understand Erdogan's reforms or not? Is it beside the point? And the other question I wanted to raise, also related to Turkey, was about the reform of the composition of the Constitutional Court. At the time before 2010, if I remember well, the members of the court were only appointed by the parliament, which was a bit weird. Is it the case, or am I mistaken? And so increasing the input of other authorities was not totally observed by international standards. So I was wondering whether it's an error I had in mind, or whether you, Eric, you can confirm that.
Thanks for your question, but I'm so sorry because my English is very, very bad. So I have to speak in French if it's possible. Merci de cette question, de ces questions. Alors c'est vrai que au-delà de l'aspect technique des réformes, il y a des explications sur la logique qui était poursuivie par Erdogan et sa majorité. D'abord, je pense qu'il a critiqué lui-même l'absence d'indépendance des juges de la Cour constitutionnelle, l'absence de l'indépendance des membres, en tout cas pour certains d'entre eux, du Conseil supérieur des juges et des procureurs, parce que faisant partie de l'establishment laïque, c'est-à-dire que ce sont des juges assez âgés qui étaient en place et qui étaient plutôt estampillés JP, c'est-à-dire relevant plutôt du parti politique qui avait été formé à l'origine par Atatürk. Et le souci d'Erdogan, c'était de faire place nette et de remplacer ces juges-là par des juges beaucoup plus proches, politiquement parlant. Et c'est vrai que le coup d'État, enfin, la tentative de coup d'État ratée, lui a donné une occasion monumentale d'accélérer le processus qui était le sien. Là, c'est devenu véritablement caricatural et beaucoup de juges ont été pointés du doigt parce que, étant gulenistes, parce que, étant proche de Fethullah Gülen, qui a été présenté comme celui qui avait fomenté ce coup d'État. Par exemple, dans la Cour constitutionnelle, à l'époque, il y a 2 juges qui ont été écartés par la Cour constitutionnelle elle-même. Donc, ceci est intéressant, d'autant plus que la Cour constitutionnelle a refusé d'examiner les décrets-lois qui portaient révocation des autres juges. Mais elle a quand même mis de côté 2 juges constitutionnels en son sein qui ont été présentés comme des gulenistes. Et ça a été le cas aussi dans le Haut Conseil des juges et des procureurs. Si ma mémoire est bonne, 4 membres ont été écartés de ce conseil-là parce que présentés comme étant gulenistes. Alors, le problème avec cette question que vous avez évoquée, cher Guillaume, c'est qu'à un moment donné, on ne sait pas comment on va pouvoir améliorer le système. Je crois que c'était une autre question. Parce qu'en fait, il faudra un nécessaire changement politique préalable. On sait que Erdogan a gagné les élections récemment. Vraisemblablement, il est plutôt bien en place et il aimerait y rester plus longtemps, au moins jusqu'en 2033, ce qui va lui laisser le temps quand même de placer beaucoup de ses proches dans l'ensemble du système politico-administrativo-juridictionnel turc. Et quand il y aura changement politique, ceux qui vont arriver, ils vont trouver un système qui est celui d'Erdogan. Et ils vont penser à un changement du système, mais pour changer les juges, parce qu'ils vont considérer qu'ils ne sont pas indépendants, puisqu'ils tentent des gens de l'AKP. Donc avec ce système-là et cette réflexion, on voit qu'il n'y a pas la distance nécessaire entre le pouvoir exécutif, la majorité politique en place et les juges et l'appareil judiciaire, en tout cas en Turquie. Donc on a l'impression que c'est quelque chose qui, malheureusement, risque de se reproduire sans qu'on trouve une fin salvatrice à cela.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm just going to make a transition with a quote from Adam Michnik that was read in the French Senate a few days ago. Poland is on the highway to Ankara, Budapest, and to Moscow. I wonder to what extent this is true, and I found the idea quite fun in the context of what you just said about Ankara and about how the things are going on. Okay, so this session is over. Thank you so much for this wonderful panel of.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Hope that you are going to stay with us in order to explain to our Israeli friends how to do revolution, right? Michal is going to take over me and I'm disappearing. I'm just going to say that the transition is really nice in the sense that, you know, the first big scale manifestations, Anna, you alluded to them, but you said that they were not that big scale. Still, 2070, thousands of Polish people were on the streets to defend constitution. This defense of the constitution went on for years and for years. We still have traces of it. Now Israel has been defending the state of law, so to speak, and Israeli right-wing ministers went to Poland and asked the Polish right-wing parties, the governor, like whatever ministers, how to calm down the population, how to deal with the population. So we are talking about two countries that share many aspects of their difficult histories, so to speak. Michal, the floor is yours. I'm disappearing. So Michal,
Okay.
is from Bar-Ilan University, and she's almost family given our common, whatever.
Okay, hello, and hello to everyone, and thank you for inviting us. Thank you for inviting me. I'm currently also the Dean of the Faculty of Law at Bar-Ilan University, so you can imagine this is a very challenging position, especially where in my university we have all diverse perspective about the current legal reform, legal upheaval, legal revolution, and I come from the field of jurisprudence and conflict resolution. I would say a few words before presenting the panelists. I think Israel is experiencing a very interesting moment in its evolvement, constitutional moments, maybe because I'm a bit optimistic. I would also hope that it will bring to more understanding and finally more dialogue, but basically it's a crisis. It's an identity crisis. We are much more polarized today than we have been a few months ago, and suddenly everybody cares about the law. Everybody cares about the reforms and their different sections. People are engaged and are in the streets. I think the panelists here and many of the people that we know are in the streets. And there is also a sense of, I think, impact and real effects of the demonstration and of the public opinion. And I feel that the title of the webinar is Legal Reforms and Their Ambiguities. So I would like ambiguous relation to democracy. So I would like to point to ambiguities that are important for me. One of them is the relation to legal formalism. I said I deal with jurisprudence. Israel has been going through a process of constant debate about formalism, and law with its different aspiration to formality has been attacked or has been under a critique in the past decades. I mean, the idea is that law is separate from politics, is given to mechanical application, is dispassionate, is procedurally built for rational adjudication, detached from practice and from relational aspects. All these ideas about the formality of law have been under attack, have been imported to Israel by various legal actors. And I think part of the experience that we have today is based on this idea that became populist, that there is a decline of formalism. So Israel is a post-formalist country, legal culture, at least the way I perceive it. And the questions of the reforms and the ambiguity is where are we going? Are we reconstructing law again as formalist? Are we building a new reconstructive perspective of law? I think this is an important ambiguity, and the current upheaval made us think about it. The second ambiguity is the conflict resolution engagement of me, or the conflict resolution perspective on the dispute. There is currently a call against settlement, against compromise, and many of the people of the street in the streets are really calling us not to reach any agreement and to fight. And for me, of course, it creates a kind of an ambivalence and difficulty. But on the other hand, I think a very important constitutional moment in Israel that really made a change, and I think in a way made all the reforms, I don't think any of the reforms, a section of the reforms today is going to be finally enacted. The important moment was most people said, we don't agree that such tremendous changes will be done without broad consent of the public. No matter what the content it is, I think most of the people came to the streets, maybe 500,000 people at some moment, and this was the turning point in which really the current, I think, rebellion against the concrete reforms has been determined, and in a sense, the reforms are I don't think any of the sections of the reform are going to be implemented. Maybe some of them. I don't think the fight is over. I think there are many dangers, but I think it's a very interesting moment in which the aspiration to reach a consensus across the polarized opinion became very clear. And I think this moment in Israel also raises the need to create a broad foundation for democracy based on dialogue, based on consensus, not necessarily about judges telling people about values and deciding cases in some issues in which they need a broader consensus. I don't know how to conduct this process. I'm actually taking time, which I don't have, so I won't go deeply into it, but I couldn't help it from stating my own position on this, which may be different from other panelists, and I would really like to hear that. But I think ambiguities are important. We need to embrace them, and we need to think creatively about how to work with them in order to strengthen democracy. This is at least my hope. So we will begin with Professor Itai Bar-Simantov from my own university, Bar-Ilan University. He teaches constitutional law. Each speaker will have 15 minutes. So please, Itai.
Thank you very much, Michal, and thank you very much to our friends in Science Po and all the organizers for this wonderful workshop. I already learned a lot, and the similarities between the systems is indeed very interesting and also troubling, I think. So as we decided among the panelists to divide our talks between each other, I will just give the background, just to give the information about what is background to the reform and what was proposed as part of the reform, and then I'll leave it to my two other panelists to discuss other aspects of the reform, of the dangers of it, and also what did civil society do and what is the role of civil society. So let's begin. Just a brief background to understand the Israeli system of government and legal system. We're a parliamentary democracy with a unicameral parliament, the Knesset. We don't have an entrenched constitution, but this is a tricky thing that some people don't understand abroad, and they ask, how could you teach constitutional law if you don't have a constitution? So we don't have an entrenched constitution, but we do have constitutional norms called basic laws. The problem is that although they were recognized by the Supreme Court as our equivalent of the Constitution in terms of their normative status, in the sense that a regular law of parliament that is abridging the constitutional text of the basic laws could be invalidated by the court. So in this respect, they are similar to Constitution, but the crucial issue is that they're not an entrenched constitution, meaning that the way they are enacted are by the same parliament in the very exact same legislative process. And Israel has a very lax system of and rules of legislations, and even no quorum rules. So in theory, tomorrow, the government could use its majority in parliament and pass any basic law at once, and also relatively easily abolish any basic law at once. In theory, in one day or in one night, they can enact a new basic law with a vote of 1 versus 0 in a regular legislative process in parliament. So this is one of the weaknesses or challenges that we had even before the reform. Other than that, unlike almost all established or full democracies, we lack many of the common checks and balances that you would see in other systems, and some systems have all of them, some systems have at least some of them, but we have no rigid constitution, as I said. We have no bicameralism or two legislative houses that can check and balance each other. We don't have a presidential veto. We don't have a multi-level governance with a federalist structure. We don't have a systems of elections, such as regional elections, that would ensure that parliament members would be at least partly loyal to the voters and not only to the head of their party. We don't have supranational courts such as the European Court of Justice or the European Court of Human Rights. We don't have supranational multi-level governance such as EU, etc. So some of the things that you at least do have even in Hungary and Poland today, we originally did not have. And to add this challenge is that officially, of course, we are a democracy and we have separation of powers, and we have, you see here in the picture, the Supreme Court of Israel, the government, and the Israeli parliament. And we have basic law, the judiciary, basic law, the government, basic law, the Knesset. But in practice, we have a very weak separation of powers, with the government having very strong control over parliament and its legislative agenda and legislative power. And in practice, governmental bills in various Knessets and terms had even more than 90% success rate of governmental bills being passed, because the government always has the majority in parliament and uses coalition, strict coalition rules in the votes that are used more and more, almost in all votes. And even when there are private member bills, the main institution that decides whether the Knesset would actually enact it or not is the government's Committee on Legislation, which basically tells all the members of parliament who are from the coalition, which again are always the majority, to vote according to what the government prefers. And also, so in the role of who legislates in practice in Israel, so of course, officially it's the Israeli Knesset, the parliament. In practice, it is the government that really controls legislation. And also the other work or role of parliament of oversight and legislative oversight of the government is also very weak, and our institutions are very weak. What we do have as of now is we have a relatively strong and independent legal system. But the problem is, and this again is the background even before the reforms, right? So the problem is that this is practically the only effective check and balances that we have on the Israeli executive, the government in the executive branch in Israel. And this is a background which in its outset already creates a weakness and a problem for any reform that would undermine the independence of the judiciary. So this is the background, very, very briefly. It's Israeli governance 101, a bit about the new government and how we got here. So as you may know, Israel is currently in a 4-year process already of a political crisis that started to a large extent not because of ideological issues or traditional right or left issues, but because the longtime incumbent prime minister was indicted on charges of corruption in 2019. Since then, we had a political crisis that it's manifested, among other things, in 5 rounds of elections in 3 years, which is unprecedented in Israel. And in one of those rounds, there was actually a government that was able to oust Netanyahu. It was Bennett-Lapid government, but it was a very fragile and very diverse government, and it did not last long. Basically, in June 2022, Parliament dispersed, and in November 2022, Netanyahu-led right-wing bloc wins the election. Because of our election rules, and we don't have a lot of time to explain it, although the vote was almost 50-50 between the Netanyahu-led right-wing wing and the so-called Coalition for Change wing, in practice, in terms of the number of seats, the Netanyahu-led coalition won a relatively strong majority, 64 seats out of 120 in the Israeli parliament. And in December 2022, Netanyahu formed his new government, and it is the most right-wing government in Israeli history. And one of the challenges, and this is very relevant to what we'll talk about, is it's the first time in Israeli history that all components of the coalition, all parties comprising the coalition, have some interest or agenda to weaken the judicial system and to so-called reform the legal system. And indeed, the very first thing this government has done, although officially Netanyahu said, okay, we have an agenda of the economy and security threats, Iran, whatever. The very first thing they did is 2 weeks after the swearing in of the government, the Justice Minister Yariv Levin had a big press conference and unveiled the government's plan for a constitutional overhaul of the judicial system, or the so-called legal reform. Maybe I'll just say one more thing. Although it is a proposal of the Minister of Justice, for various political maneuvering reasons, they decided not to enact it as governmental bills, not to enact it as governmental bills, but instead as committee and private member bills by the Knesset, led by the chair of the Constitution Committee, Simcha Roth. Okay, so very briefly, I have only 5 minutes, I see, so I'll just give a very brief overview of what are the components or the major components of the proposed so-called reform. So one major component is politicizing the judicial appointment system. Today, we have a committee of 9, which is some balance between politicians, judges, and members of the bar. The idea is to change it completely and grant the coalition absolute control over the appointment of judges. I don't have time to go into all the details. Maybe in the Q&A, if people will be interested, I'll give more details. Prohibiting judicial review of basic laws. As we said, we don't have a constitution, but we have basic laws. At least in theory, the court today can invalidate basic laws. And now one of the proposals is to completely prohibit judicial review of basic laws, regardless of what their content is, and also regardless of how they were enacted. And I just want to remind you what I said, that the basic laws could be enacted by a majority of 1 to 0 in one day and can include theoretically everything, including we abolish the Knesset, okay? Another important issue is undermining judicial review of legislation and making it almost, and now I'm talking not basic laws, but regular legislation, parliamentary legislation, making it almost impossible. They require a super majority of 80%, 13 out of 15 of the justices will have to agree in order to invalidate a law. And some constitutional provisions and rights would not be subject to judicial protection at all, even in 15 out of 15. And remember that after they'll politicize the judicial appointments, you'll have at least a few judges who would never join a decision to invalidate a law. If for some reason all this would not be enough, there's also a notwithstanding or override clause, meaning that by a simple 61 majority, which the coalition always have, they could reenact the legislation. It was even written in a way that they don't have to wait for the judicial decision. They can, in advance, immunize the law from judicial review if they pass it in the first stance by a majority of 61 and say notwithstanding what's written in the basic laws. And this would be our override clause for all rights and all constitutional provisions. I don't have a lot of time. I'll just say diluting judicial review of the executive and abolishing the unreasonableness standard, politicizing, weakening the legal service of the government and the Attorney General. And this is only what our Minister of Justice called the first phase of the reform. We see a lot of other plans. It's now early to say which one of them would actually materialize, but a lot of private member bills and other plans that the overall story is undermining accountability over the executive. It could mean changes to election rules that would make it harder for the opposition to win, shutting down or limiting public broadcasting, restricting civil society, some ideas to restrict academia as well, threatening to dismantle the Israeli Bar Association, etc. And originally, the plan was to pass it in a high-speed blitz style of legislative acts. The original plan was to pass everything before April 2nd. But then something, if everything I said until now depressed you totally, here's the optimistic end. Then what happened is an unprecedented protest by Israeli society that Israelis showed that they actually care a lot about democracy and are willing to fight for democracy. And this has led to the fact that the Prime Minister has officially proclaimed that they are, I won't even a full minute, that they are, at least for now, temporarily stopping the legislative process of the reform. And as Michal said, there are various opinions whether and to what extent they will even enact them at the end of the day. And right now there are calls for compromises, etc. So I will stop here. I would leave it to my two other panelists to discuss what are the dangers of the reform and what is the role of civil society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Itai. This was very, very helpful. Our next speaker is actually in Paris, sitting with you, I think. Dr. Ofra Bloch from Tel Aviv University. She teaches and writes about public law and inequality. She will speak about the historical aspects of this debate. Thanks.
Okay. Where's the mic? Can you hear me at home? So you hear me enough. I'm gonna try to be short, though they say never to say that at the beginning because no one is ever short when they start talking. So I might be, because you're gonna get to hear me later at the plenary panel as well. And I'm gonna try and give some historical and theoretical background, and some of it would be describing, and some of it would be already thoughts that I had been thinking about others in Israel. I've been working with a colleague from Hebrew University, Professor Barak Medina. So it's going to be a little bit of everything, I think. So you already heard from Itai about the pretty unbalanced and weak, not sure even if to call it a constitutional system, right, that we had in Israel, where for sure we have very little, not to say one check on the governmental power or the majoritarian power. It depends if you look separately at the Israeli parliament and the government. And the reform has been proposing to do different things, but that you already heard about, but that essentially are going to weaken that check that is the court and its ability to do effective judicial review in Israeli parliament and government. And now let's try to give it some historical and theoretical background. So I'm not gonna go all the way back, though, just to say that up until the 1990s in Israel, we had what you would call parliament superiority and no judicial review on legislation, or just a very little weak type that is institutional type. And then in the 1990s, the Knesset, so the Knesset is the Israeli parliament, I'm going to use both terms, legislated the new basic laws that protect some human rights, not all of them. So dignity, liberty, property, liberty of occupation were all protected in 92, sorry. And the court took it, the Supreme Court, the famous Aaron Barak Supreme Court, that was then the president of the Supreme Court, took it as a cue to start performing judicial review on legislation in 1995. And the justification that it found and that the rhetoric used is like the classical liberal justifications for judicial review. So he even says in the famous first opinion where they announced their authority to perform judicial review, Barak said, this is why I have my notes here. And they're tiny, I don't know why they're in the font number 10. Okay, Israel is a constitutional democracy. We have now joined the community of democratic countries, among them United States, Canada, Germany, Italy, South Africa, not listing France, sorry. With constitutional bills of rights, we have become part of the human rights revolution that characterizes the second half of the 20th century, the lessons of the Second War. The new constitutions include extensive sections protecting human rights. Judicial review of constitutionality of laws infringing human rights has become the norm in most countries. This revolution has not passed us by. We joined it in March 1992. So it's very much, and there is more of a liberal kind of normative idea. And it's the basic idea that we basically, I think, I used to start my Conlo classes like that, with this theoretical idea that we have democracies, but we have this system of democracy. Democracy is the system that is meant to protect the idea that we're all free and equal human beings, that therefore we have self-rule, that's the best way, and therefore the different ways and principles of democracy and how it works. So the idea that there is bunch of rights that the court has to protect. And so, and since then, so when in the 1990s and already like mid and late 1990s in Israel, since then for like a decade and a half or even 2 decades, I would say there are a lot of talks about the Israeli Supreme Court as like this super activist, right, judicial activism court, or at least in Israel, this talk about the Barak court is very prevalent. I would say that over some issues, it is super activist or overactive, I would say, overreaching.
Sorry, I'm being told that you are not greatly heard, so
okay.
Mike?
They know whatever. Okay. No. You have to
Okay,
mute something.
Yeah. Yeah, but how can I mute them here? Oh, okay, last
We were
Can you hear me
perfectly
better?
before.
have
We heard it
had to
perfectly.
say
Now we
that
have
you do,
an
because
echo.
No?
The bid can hear me. He's gonna talk after, so that's the most important part. He would
No,
Okay.
we heard everything. We heard everything perfectly. It was good.
everything. I don't have to. Okay.
This is what's, I got message that they
I
did.
can redo the 90s. And then I was saying that since this, what we call the constitutional revolution, the Barak constitutional revolution of the 1990s, so in some aspects and some issues, the court was very much active, and then on others it was very much passive. So some issues not even might be discussing but never deciding on, such as the occupation of this and the settlements, the legality of the settlements. Only like the periphery of this project of Israel and other big issues are out of reach for the courts. That's maybe, no, that's not my computer. And I think that, and many people think that, and the supporters of the reform kind of picture themselves as a backlash movement to a large degree to what we had in the 90s and 1990s in Israel. And this backlash, I would say, because Anna asked me to say something about the basic law of the nation state of Israel of a few years ago that was legislated, that kind of depicted Israel not as a Jewish democratic state, as this very much bizarre creature, but as the nation state of the Jewish people, saying nothing about equality whatsoever, and not so much or not at all about democracy. So I think that backlash that we've been seeing in the past decade or a little more is both a substantive backlash to liberal values or to democratic values, and a procedural backlash to the court. These two not always align, right? Because if you do a substantive backlash that tries to use the power of the court just to transfer it to the other side, to the more Jewish or anti-liberal side, then you're still using the court. But then the other version of it is what we've been seeing in this reform, that is more an attack on the authority of the court to even perform judicial review or have it in an effective way. So I think that this current moment of the reform is to a large degree like the peak of this backlash. The supporters of the reform kind of they say that they are the true voice of the people, or at least of the majority of the people in Israel. They position themselves against the court in a serious way, and specifically against Barak, that has not been serving on the court for a few decades now. And well, we can easily see that these claims of being the true voice of the people or of the majority are claims that have been transferring around the world. We've heard about Poland and we've heard about Hungary now. And well, it's pretty easy to rebuttal this claim and by saying simply democracy is not pure majoritarianism, right? There is more to it if it's the rule of the people, not of the majority. And of course, the supporters of the reform, I saw have been using these terms in a very manipulative way, utilizing them to serve a very specific narrow version of majoritarian rule. I think there is still something to this critique that we have to listen to. Of course, this is also not unique to Israel, and we know of many theoretical thinkers that have been thinking either in the context of the US or of Europe about the democratic deficit of judicial review. And that this tension that is always there, or a paradox that there is always there in constitutional democracies, right? That there is something undemocratic or that is at least democratically challenged in strong judicial review. And so scholars write, Waldron, Unger, that are maybe the older generation, and the newer scholars like Roberto Gorgarella or Semaine, they've been all telling us to like notice this project that we're doing, that there is something to this populist critique. Some of them say, like Semaine, throw judicial review altogether. It's not the way to go. It's both not working and it's anti-majoritarian. Well, I think we have to notice context when we say such things. So I'm not on a rescue mission to save everything that the court did, not at all. But I think we have to look at the Israeli context and each state at the context that it's been struggling with, and to see what are the stakes in weakening or eliminating judicial review altogether. I think in Israel that the stakes are high on two ends. And the first and most prominent one are for minorities that can't protect themselves through regular politics for the parliament. In Israel, that would be Palestinians on both sides of the Green Line, and maybe especially Palestinians in the occupied territories that cannot vote, but also the Palestinian minority within Israel, citizens of Israel, that would go to John Hart-Ely argument on protecting minorities that cannot protect themselves. I now moved into the normative part of my talk, if you didn't notice. And then the other big risk that we can experience is risk to being able to have a democratic procedure that would allow a free election and kind of change of regimes over time. And so I think we have to maybe change the way we think about judicial review to protect. I'm always, when I'm thinking about it, I'm unclear if it's obvious or completely unobvious, but I would say nonetheless to have it as a form of democratic judicial review rather than a liberal judicial review. That would mean to protect those who are challenged and the minorities that can contextually change even in each state. So it can change in Israel, and it's not just the Palestinians, it's also refugees and people it can change and include other minorities. And certain aspects of the democratic procedure that would mean the court would have to stay out of many realms that is previously been deeply involved in, such as corruption, political corruption in Israel, or even protecting, and that's the more controversial part of this idea, even protecting certain human rights of the majority that can work and organize to protect itself through regular politics. So to conclude, I think we're in a moment of this wake-up call for showing us the democratic deficit in our system. But the fact that we recognize this doesn't mean that we have to take what their reformers are proposing seriously. The fact that they noticed a real problem doesn't mean, or that they've been affected by a real problem doesn't mean we have to go with their solution. But I think we have to rethink our system, and this was just one way that me and Barak Medina think to go about it, but there are many others, I guess. That's it.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. This was just on time. And I think that, first of all, we have some 15 minutes more because we started later. So don't worry, we have time for discussions. And I think we have an interesting presentation of the reforms, and then the question of judicial review and the question of the judges as a kind of king philosophers. So now we have a philosopher and a lawyer, Professor David Anoch from the Hebrew University, who will take us through the theoretical aspects of this subject. Thank you. Please, David.
Well, I'll do some of the theoretical stuff, but also I want to talk a little bit about the protests. And thank you, everyone. Thanks, Mickey. Thanks, Anna. Thank you for the organizers. So I want to start with a few sentences about how it is that the protest actually makes a difference. Because for the first time, at least in my life, I feel that these protests really do. I even feel that when we write op-eds, they now make a difference. So I want to say how I think it is, because really nobody in the corridors of political power cares about my op-eds or Itai's op-eds or Mickey's, or about how many people are there on the street. I don't think anyone cares directly about this. But we've seen three main mechanisms that have tremendous effect, I think. One is not so surprising. It's the international arena, mostly, I think, the American administration. You know about Biden showing a very cold attitude towards Netanyahu. And in general, I think it's very clear whenever some really weird topic comes up, a new legislative initiative, the Americans can just shoot it down within minutes if they want to. So that's one source of one power here that does work. Another power that does work a little bit more surprisingly is some of the economic powers in Israel that have realized from very early on that these reforms are very bad for business. And the government is, while in no way sensitive to what I will say or write, are very sensitive to whether leading high-tech companies are considering taking their money and their operations out of Israel. The third really surprising power that made a difference was protests within the military. In Israel, a lot of the military are people on reserve, and there have been the kind of outcries from the officers in reserves that we have not seen in the past. We've, of course, seen such protests in the past, but in very small numbers. And this got people in power very worried. So why do I think that the protest matters? I think the protest matters because these three different leverage points are all highly sensitive to the protests. The extent to which the American administration is willing to intervene or to place any pressure on the Israeli government is highly sensitive to what's going on the streets on every Saturday night. And whenever an op-ed is published, two more high-tech executives read and have some thoughts about whether or not to exert pressure within their power. Similarly for people who are on reserve duty in the military. So I think that actually the protest, which has been remarkably successful, even though nothing is final yet, I think the way it works is not directly by affecting people in positions of power, but by affecting these three sort of leverage points that in turn affect people in power. Okay, now I want to raise three problems for the protest, and you'll see that they are, some of them are more theoretical than others. The first one is whether to focus on procedure or on substance. In Itai's presentation, and for the most part in Eötvös' presentation, you heard about the procedure, say the overhaul of the judicial appointment committee, and so on. And these are, of course, extremely important matters. But it's also important to think, why are these people interested in these procedural things? I mean, some of the rhetoric is pseudo-democratic, but I would urge you not to buy it. They do not care about procedures. What they want is the things that winning over the battle over procedures will allow them to do with the power that they will have. And we know what they want to do because there are these legislative proposals on the table. They have been very outspoken about some of these things. So they want to abolish any liberal or liberal seeming aspect of the state of Israel. They want to have much more leeway to discriminate, even more than we discriminate today against our Arab population. They want to have total freedom to do whatever they want in the occupied territories. They want to have much more influence for Orthodox parties and ultra-Orthodox parties on many matters within Israel. Now, this is hard because there is no consensus about these matters, and sometimes it's more convenient to present the protest as if it's purely about the process. It's about, say, not introducing a constitutional reform without a wide consensus, or it's about the separation of powers or something along the lines. But I think that this would be, it would be a mistake to, it's okay to focus on these things, but it would be a mistake to only focus on that. So let me give you what I think is an analogy. From what I understand, Viktor Orbán very early on decided to decrease the number of seats in the Hungarian parliament. And there had been, before Orbán was in power, an interesting discussion of what's the right number of parliament members for a country like Hungary. And there were, decent arguments, I'm assuming, on all sides. So one could engage Orbán only on those arguments, whether it's a good idea to cut the number of parliament seats I think in roughly half or something like this. Maybe someone can correct me. But that would be a mistake because you have to keep your eye on the ball. The reason he did it is to then allow him to do enough by way of gerrymandering to secure his staying in power for many, many years, and also to allow the things he wants to do in power. So it's important to talk about these things as well. Talking about what's going on in Israel now, only in terms of procedure, without keeping one's eye on the substantive ball, as it were. That would be analogous to conducting the discussion with Orbán about how many seats should be in power, without taking into account what changing the number of seats is supposed to serve, and indeed, as a matter of historical fact, has served. So I think it's really important to put liberalism back in the picture here, and I think that liberals should desert their somewhat really annoying and somewhat spoiled illusions that these liberal values don't have to be fought over. They have to be fought on every time, and currently we are losing. So that's, I think, the main thing that should be in front of our eye as we also discuss procedures. Of course, once you go fully liberal, you may be reducing the size of the protest, the size of the consensus, and that in itself is, of course, an important strategical problem. Okay, so that was one question, whether we want to go strategic or procedural. The other is, at least for people like us, for academics who are also thinking of this as a part of the protest, an important question here is, how intellectual do we want to go? And here I want to use the talk about democracy, because, as you know, the bad guys love to talk about democracy, and they insist that is just what democracy is. They've won the majority, as Itai mentioned, 64 seats, and so on. And they accuse others of, so you don't want the people to rule themselves? Who do you want to rule the people? These really small number of judges. They even have a name for that, right? They call it, it's becoming, I think, more popular now to call it a juristocracy, right? And are you a jurist? Nobody wants to be a juristocrat, right? Now, there are different ways of responding to it. I believe that these claims are insincere, but forget sincerity for now. How do we respond to these points, to these arguments? And here, there are simple, quick responses that you can come up with in public talks, for instance, or in the public arena. but they don't give the full picture. The full picture is deeper and more complicated. Perhaps this is one of the things that Tofo was hinting at. But being deep and intricate is not always a good way of being effective on the public arena. So here's a good response, I think, that works on the public arena. You can say such things as, democracy is about the separation of powers. This rings true to many people, so you can play that card with some success. That's nice. Here's another thing that you can say. Not every constitutional arrangement becomes democratic simply in virtue of being supported by the majority, right? And just give examples, like, what size of a majority would suffice to disenfranchise women, and furthermore, to make it the case that that's a democratic measure, right? So you can use such examples, and that's fine. But that's not the full story. The full story is much deeper, and it runs all the way to the justifications of democracy, to why it is not the word. No one should care philosophically about the word democracy, right? What matters are the considerations in the virtue of which we found democracy an attractive ideal to begin with. And the deep point that I think most of this populism stuff in Israel and probably elsewhere too is just deeply mistaken about, is that once we are clear about the underlying ideal or probably ideals of democracy, we will see that these claims, the claims that democracy is all about majoritarianism or whatever, have really nothing at all to stand on. Thanks, Mekki, I see that. The ideals underlying democracy, and of course there are controversies about these, but maybe they have something to do with equality, with the equal distribution of political power, or maybe they have something to do with dignity, or maybe they have something to do with non-domination, or maybe they have something to do with just sort of Churchillian instrumental thought that things are going to go a little bit less badly if we are democratic than otherwise. All these justifications are important. All of them may make democracy important. The crucial thing is that if they make democracy important, the kind of democracy they make important is, in every case of this justification, already institutional. It's not as if there is this really simple pre-institutional conception of democracy, and institutions sort of resemble it or approximate it to higher or lower degrees. The ideal of democracy, the kind of democracy that is actually worth having, that to which we may owe our allegiance, that we thought was attractive to begin with, that is already highly institutionalized and in no way about just one person, one vote. So that's the deeper thing that we should think about here. And I don't know how to communicate the deeper point to a wider audience. I'm not even sure I communicated it very effectively here now. All right, last point. Another huge challenge facing the protest now, or a question that people are asking themselves, is what now, right? Because there are these talks and attempts at compromises that Mekki also mentioned, and it's not clear how we should be oriented towards those. It's not clear what the sort of end play is. People sometimes ask this question, what's the exit game? How do you think things are going to unfold? I mean, at the end of the day, at some point, there's going to be another election, and it's not clear that we're going to suddenly win, in big numbers for the first time ever or something, right? Or for the first time in the last few decades. So it's really not clear how to proceed. Another thing that is that we are starting to lose is the energy of the masses, as was clear that was going to happen. I thought it would happen much earlier. So the numbers of people there on the streets is not constant. I think that from time to time there's going to be a new provocation, and the numbers will rise again. But the numbers are diminishing at least a little bit. One of the challenges here is how wide we want to go compared to how consistent we want to be. Because if we're going to be consistent, then of course, if we're fighting for democracy, we cannot exclude the occupation. We cannot just not have that conversation. In the last demonstration on Saturday night, it became well known that an activist and a colleague of ours, a legal academic, who is also Palestinian, was invited to speak in the main protest, but only on the condition that she would not mention the occupation. And she refused. Now you can see where it's coming from, right? It's coming from the hope of getting as many people on board with the protest as possible. And that is a good tactical hope to have, but it also excludes others, and it renders the messages of the protests much less consistent. And I think that's going to be a major decision point for the protests going from now on. I also think that people in the coalition are going to do whatever they can to play this card against the protests. I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for just on time. And now it's time for questions, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Can I just make a tiny remark? Because from what I know, and let me just, so we were talking, just a tiny follow-up of what David was saying. So let me show you this slide, if it works. Almost. So there were these manifestations, demonstrations that David was alluding to. There were some op-eds published by some academics, so I'm just showing a few of them. Not only op-eds, also actions. You have seen one of them. And here, just a few pictures from the Paris demonstration against full democracy. And I think that someone from Paris demonstration is here. Yes, so thanks so much for being here. So these are the pictures again from the demonstration a few days ago against Bezalel Smotrich at the OECD. So I just wanted to show you that even in Paris we are doing some things. So this I'm stopping here and I'm going to go. You'll have to go again. Please. Okay.
I can ask a question if there is not a question from the audience.
There is one. Voila.
Ah, there is. Okay. Yes.
Hi, my name is Roman Zinigrad. I want to use the forum of the Israelis here and also the comparative constitutionalists to run by an idea that David mentioned and indirectly was mentioned also in Pascal's question, which is the role of the army in the Israeli separation of powers. Not as a institution that has some political implications, not as an institution that may be politicized, but as an institution that actually plays a role in the formal separation of powers in the country. Now, some Americans have been writing or started writing on this even before this mess in Israel started, but especially, and I'm trying to think about it in the context of Israel, so I would love your thoughts. We all know that the Israeli military is involved, has huge political impact in its foreign relations, the military complex. Of course, the economic impact of the army in Israel is huge, but not enough discussed. But I think that here in the example of the reservists, maybe even changing or being the crucial part or the decisive part in changing the government's mind, maybe should be reconsidered not as part of the people of the protest, as David, for instance, mentioned, but part of the government separation of powers. In which case, to be very brief, there are serious implications of how we look at the army. So, for example, the nature of the military appointments. Are they politicized or not? The separation between men and women in the army, these should be considered not only as affecting the military or how the nation looks like, but actually how the government functions and how liberal the factions in the government are. And so just as one example to think about this, not only in the context of the reform, this recent case of the tragic death of two soldiers, a male and a female soldier in a military post that was criticized almost explicitly by the right-wing TV channel saying, well, they were there together in a military post in the middle of the night. That's why we can have men and women serving in the military together. Again, this, we all know how this goes in the, how it runs by the conservative versus democratic discourse in Israel. But if we look at it from the point of view, again, from maybe not a fourth separate branch of government, but a very important one, maybe it has to be reconsidered as a much more substantive processes and changes, not only in the reform, but generally how the country looks like. Thank you.
Okay. Who would like to answer? Maybe least I can begin by saying that this is a very important point, and I think part of maybe the turning point was a point where I think the questions of security or questions of the army were there, and some of the people who really strive for settlements just say, okay, we don't care about what is really there about, but if there will be a point in which the army will obey the Supreme Court and the police will obey the government, this will be a constitutional disaster, and therefore just let's try now to, to focus on stopping the reforms in order to function. So this is a very important part, but maybe let's hear how the other speakers.
Can I say something on this? So this is an interesting point. I don't think I've thought about it enough, but it's important to distinguish between the influence of the military and the influence of, say, the reservists within the military. The military as an institution, I don't think has been a major player in this crisis so far, and certainly not in terms of separation of powers. And when the reservists did their stuff and were influential, they created pressure within the military on military commanders and so on. And some of the military commanders did a good job of, as it were, sending the message upwards towards eventually towards Netanyahu. But it's not as if anything here. It's not as if the military as an organization, as an institution, had this initiative. I think we should also be careful. People say now about courts, you should be careful about putting too much trust in courts, partly because the composition of courts also changes. Well, the composition of the Israeli military has been changing for decades now. And the people who are now in the military, including fairly high-ranking officers, and who will be the reservists in a couple of decades, are more likely in large numbers to object to, say, the dismantling of settlements and the end of the occupation than they are to counter democratic measures within Israel. I do want to mention, following up on Mekki, that the really important point at which certainly the military chief of staff, but maybe also other officers, are going to be significant is going to be the moment of a constitutional crisis, when officials have to actually decide who they are obeying, who it is who is speaking on behalf of the state, of the kingdom, rather than on behalf of a specific part of its government or on their own. For the most part, this has been avoided so far. It's not clear that it will be. And it's not clear, but even though for the most part it hasn't been avoided so far, there have been some moments of this kind, including fairly recently about allowing some settlers back to a settlement that had been dismantled in the past. And on that occasion, the military, without, as far as I can see, any kind of regret, went with the government against the judicially obligating positions. So this doesn't bode well.
Okay, thanks so much. Other questions, remarks? I was just sort of coming back again to the question of the protest, but I was really impressed by the depoliticization of the protest. Is it genuine, or is it illusory, in the sense that in Poland the protests are not they are party politicized? And is it really as clear as it looks like from Israel, in Israel? Is it really devoid of any party politics?
Maybe I'll start, if I may. I think one of the impressive things about the protests that they were really grassroots and really bottom up, and really people just started organizing and went to the streets, and a lot of various civil society organizations, including law professors, but also academia, doctors, practically various and very diverse parts of civil society started working. My personal view was that the opposition leaders were actually not exactly aware, and fully understanding of the gravity of the situation, and they tagged along after the fact. And until now, their control over the protests or the general, protesters is, I think, very limited. I mean, in many ways, it's a wonderful thing, and it's a very democratic thing. In some ways, it would also be challenging, because if you ask what is the position of the protest, right? And David and Michal discussed this. If there would be compromises, what is the position about possible compromises? I mean, the people negotiating right now in the president's house are the leaders of the two major opposition parties. It's not clear at all that their positions are parallel to the positions of what the protesters would actually accept or not. So in some respects, it's, the most democratic and populist, actually, countering the populist arguments for the reform by the Israeli public taking a stand. And also, I would say that Israeli polls have consistently shown, public polls have consistently shown, the majority of Israelis, including people who voted, including parts of people who voted for the coalition parties, especially the Likud, has opposed the reforms. So in that respect, it is, I think, really a populist movement. The extent that parties are now more involved, I think it's more in the institutional level of the president's house negotiations. They do sometimes in some of the protests also send speakers. Some of the places they're not very welcome, and they're not even speaking as some of the speakers in the protest.
Wow, super interesting. It also you just gave the answer to the question you asked yourself to Anna before, in the sense that there's nothing to be learned then from the protests in the two countries. They are very different from the point of view of solutions, because the Polish protests do have solutions. They bring solutions. Now you can discuss them, but they are party solutions. So this is quite tricky. It changes completely the endpoint for sure. Questions, remarks, and also people online. Michal, you wanted to ask something at some point, yeah? So I'll just.
And maybe I'll ask David. I'm not sure it's related to your second point, but there is a belief in the law. The belief in the law means that there is something inner to, that you can trust, in a sense, the stability and the conservative aspects of the development of law, and to think that really, even if you have a reform, once you appoint a judge, once you give someone the responsibility, once you even take a right-wing person and bring him into a position of, and he has his lawyer identity. So maybe through the law, we can really believe in the law to preserve a kind of stability that the reforms couldn't change. I mean, if we don't have a legal culture, or if we don't have a democratic culture, so any legal arrangement will not work for it. I mean, I just visited Switzerland, judges are elected, but it doesn't mean that, I mean, it's all about context. So in the Israeli context, do you believe that, I mean, that we are really in danger, even if the reforms were enacted? I mean, isn't the democracy strong enough, or the legal culture strong enough to resist changes that will create a kind of anti-democratic moves that are not reversible?
I believe we are in grave danger. But I share your suspicion as to the huge significance of the current reforms, right? I think we were in grave danger before the reforms too, and if we defeat the reforms, we will still be in grave danger. I agree that constitutions and constitutional measures and constitutional arrangements are not magic. They can help. They can help, for instance, in slowing down deterioration. They can't stop deterioration. If not enough people care enough about democracy, there will not be a democracy. And you can't fight that with a smarter way of formulating some paragraph in some document. I agree. I agree about that. But just like I don't think constitutions are magic, I don't think that legal education is magic either. So I don't think that so long as the people who are going to be appointed are going to be, you know, people who studied with you or with me, right? Then everything is going to be okay. People are complicated and diverse, and some of them are wonderful even in the worst circumstances. And some of them are horrible and will just try to do whatever they can to promote whatever terrible agenda they made before. And many of them are in between, and they will just, you know, flow, just go with the flow, including, you know, you can see it immediately. The minute the committee, the appointments committee becomes a little bit more political, suddenly judges sound a little bit different, right? So I think that, I don't think that constitutional measures are magic, but I think that they do have an effect. And given the background, really weak, not just democratic arrangements, as Itai mentioned, but also democratic commitments in the Israeli society, I think all of this just adds to make the danger we're in especially serious.
But the fragility that you mentioned, the fragility that was obvious even before the reform, well, it is how to address it in this. What kind of fragility do you have in mind? The lack of constitution in the first place, the fact that some things have not been solved since 48, like the separation of the state and of whatever, you know, religious institutions. Is it something that should be attacked immediately? And if so, who is able to do it right now?
Right. I don't care about constitutions that much. Again, I don't think that constitutions are magic. I think they are often a good idea. Sometimes they are a bad idea. Some people in the protest now think that what we should do is we should now aim for, at long last, having a constitution. I think that would be a horrible mistake, because if a constitution is drafted now, it's going to be a terrible constitution. Not having a constitution is much better than having the kind of constitution we're likely to have. The reason things are fragile is not that we don't have a constitution. The reason that we are so democratically fragile, the main things that determine this are different. For instance, the Israel Democratic Institute has been publishing over many years a kind of democracy index, in which one of the things it asks people is whether, I forget the exact wording, but whether the fact that Israel is a Jewish state should be understood as allowing discrimination against non-Jews. And you can just, you know, measure the numbers. And the numbers are extremely high and very much on the rise over the last few years. I'm not sure, but I think that the last numbers are in the 40% of Jews who say that, yes, Jews should have a set of privileges that non-Jews don't, and there should be this discrimination. This is not the percentage of people who think that. That's much higher, of course. This is the percentage of the people who are now willing to say this explicitly when asked. This is the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. The occupation, obviously, cannot just be a sort of an afterthought. And if you're talking about democratic culture, commitment to democratic ideals, that is hugely central and also has wide-ranging effects on other issues. So the real problems, as always, are political in the deep sense, not constitutional or legal in some smaller way.
Thank you. I think this is I would like to end with some grace or kind of optimistic hope. We are a very kind of young country. We are post-traumatic in many ways, and we have our reasons. I think we have the tension between ethnicity and liberalism. And I think the current upheaval just raised the liberal voice in society to make it sound like a religion even. And people really believe in liberal values. People go to the streets. People would not be silent anymore. And I think everybody now understands that any other new kind of compromise or settlement should take into account this important part of the Israeli society. I don't know exactly how it unfolds, and I am also not a great believer in some kind of procedure or constitution that will make us all very happy, but I think something has changed. And it's a very curious moment. And as I said, and I hope maybe David, there's some optimism to the fact that things moved. And things are not like a few months ago.
I actually agree with that. Yes.
So we are just going to have this closing session with Natalie, if you can come here, because otherwise we will not hear you. I'll just try to figure out whether it's possible, and Guillaume, of course. And of course, I didn't mention this, but this session was not organized by me and Julie only. Julie just left. But of course, with Guillaume and Soraya, who helped us from the very beginning and who were this year with us all the time. So thank you so much for being with us during the organization. And I will just abuse of the presence of Guillaume to invite him here, because otherwise it's impossible to. So I'll just, how can I do that? Maybe I'll give you some normal chairs. So it will be easier, and we'll might as well. Let's see whether I can change the camera here. Stop sharing here. And maybe the camera could go. Does it work? No, because there's no camera here. Okay. So there's no way. We have to. Où est-ce qu'elle est? Pardon? Où est-ce que tu vois le on the top? Yeah, but we have. There's literally no camera actually here. There's only here this one. Yeah, absolutely. But in this case, I just have to move this. So we can hold the right. Okay.
This is good, but there's an echo. Can you turn off one of the mics?
Sure. I'm trying to do that.
Must be this one. Or...
Can.
They will look at them from this one, and they will look at that one.
The thing is that this is not going to be physically recorded, because Zoom does not record every camera. It only records the camera that is related to the voice. This is why I'm trying to do that. But in this case, yeah, whatever. Yeah. Let's go like this.
I won't say anything interesting.
Okay, do you people hear us online? Yeah, because I'm pausing myself.
Yes, but softly.
Okay. It's now. No, okay, let's go. All right. So the closing session, it belongs to you, because we wanted to have a wrap-up session with some fundamental questions about the consequences of those reforms, not only for some legal aspects of the country, but for more general outlook on human rights on national and international level. What does it mean for the world? The things that we just mentioned in our discussions. Thank you for accepting this and before it goes.
So, well, the first comments I want to make, well, the first thing is a big thank you to all the conveners who participate and give us not only empirical data in order to fuel our reflection, but also provide us with a very, very strong insight. My views are rather pessimistic. So first of all, I have 4 remarks, basically. The first one is that...
Can you hear at home?
Exactly, as that's the message that I gave us.
We hear very softly. Yeah, we don't hear very well.
Okay. So what's the
So the most important thing I was saying was thank you to all those who participated in the conference. And I would like to make four main points. So the first one is that today, but that's the consequence of the events we've been witnessing in Europe, in Latin America, in Asia, and in the Middle East. we are witnessing the end of a lie. And this lie being the fact that constitutions are necessarily good and constitutions are necessarily valuable instruments to protect freedom, to protect equality, to protect human dignity, to protect basic political values. So constitutions are not necessarily a bounty for those constitutional values or for the values of political liberalism and democracy. What we are witnessing is the fact that autocrats have understood constitutionalism. They have understood the grammar of the organization of power, the name of which is constitutionalism. They know what sovereignty is. They know what separation of power is. They know what vertical division of power is. They know what an autonomous institution is. And they know how to instrumentalize all these pieces, all these elements of the constitutional toolkit, and how to design institutions so as not to respect the basic values of traditional 18th century constitutionalism. So my intuition and my fear is that autocratic constitutionalism is not a mistake. It's not something that comes here por casualidad, no sé. I don't know how to say it in English. It's not as far as that.
By sort of mishap, not, like unintentionally.
Yeah, that's so that's not
by chance.
Yes, it doesn't come here by chance, but it is a very strong deepening of the logic of legal formalism and of the logic of legalism. So that's not a mistake. That's not a flaw in constitutionalism. That's not bad use or uninformed use of constitutionalism that is made by authoritarian, but the deepening of the very logic of constitutionalism and the institution it gives to several political views. And that's all the more frightening because this is the internal logic of the use of legal tools. So caring about the law, as you mentioned, Michal, is of course something important, but I think that our hopes cannot rest only on the law, and that political mobilization is maybe much more important. The second aspect is a methodological aspect, and that's related to what I've just said. We should be cautious as legal scholars to avoid the position of legal positivism understood as an ideology. Bobbio distinguished very classically between three meanings of positivism. Positivism as a theory of science, positivism as a theory of law, and positivism as an ideology, according to which whatever the law is good. Because the law is the law is good. Because the law claims this, because the law prohibits this is good. And we should be very cautious when we study law, not to be too confident and to keep critical spirit alive. So maybe the dramatic examples we have discussed today have the interest, at least, to impose keeping critical spirit alive and be suspicious of the law, suspicious of the uses of the law. The other thing we saw when we compared all the examples coming from the various countries is that nowadays there is a toolkit of constitutional authoritarianism. There is a recipe. There is quite a handbook of authoritarian constitutionalism. Step by step, by discrete means, discrete reforms, and we see that the chronology of the reforms is very similar. Of course, it depends on the context, but the route to constitutional authoritarianism, the soft route to constitutional authoritarianism is quite easy to identify. First, you capture the judiciary, either the constitutional court or the ordinary judiciary. Second, you enact whatever kind of laws you want, limiting freedom of the media, limiting the power of universities, changing the electoral law, limiting the powers of NGOs by imposing them not to have contacts with foreign states or foreign authorities, or by widening the qualification of foreign influence, etc. This has been witnessed in Russia. This has been witnessed in European countries. This has also been witnessed in El Salvador, if I'm not mistaken, which quite copied and pasted the Russian law. So we see that the enemies, the authoritarians, are not isolated. There is an international of authoritarian powers, of authoritarian constitutional powers. So there is also this kind of comparative law of the bad guys. Frequently in constitutional transconstitutionalism, we focus on how much the ECHR has drawn inspiration from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, from the German Constitutional Court, and how all of them discussing with the Canadian Supreme Court are promoting human rights for gay people, for autochthonous peoples, for any kind of disfavored minority. But we should also pay attention to the circulation of constitutional solutions that takes place between authoritarian powers. The last point I wanted to make is maybe gives us some hope. We've been discussing from the viewpoint of political theory, a basic divide between two conceptions of democracy, that of majoritarian or populist democracy on the one hand, and that of liberal constitutional democracy on the other. So there may be room for hope here, because at least one and the same word is used by both of the opponents, that of democracy. Of course, they understand it in very different ways, but they take time, they make efforts to conceptualize their notion of democracy. So maybe this term offers a kind of interaction, a kind of shared vernacular, which maybe, I don't know, this is an open question, maybe acts as a limit to channel the kind of things they can do. Maybe not, maybe the word is just an empty word and you can organize a full-blown fascism on the name democracy, and there's absolutely no hope. But maybe the very language that is used by these constitutional powers, whether authoritarian or not, by these authorities, limits the kind of things they can do, and offers a shared ground for their own self-promotion, but also for their opponents to struggle against what they can do. And so maybe this kind of discussion or this kind of framing of intellectual framing of the discussion can also offer some limitation to what autocrats can do. So this is something not only lawyers have to discuss, but lawyers connected with sociologists in order to identify which group, which profession, which sector in the civil society is using these words, but also specialists of linguistics in order to see, and maybe specialists of brain activities in order to see and to identify how the words we use are conditioning the kinds of things we can do as political actors. And of course, the only one to be right in this perspective is Wittgenstein, saying that the limits of my world are the limits of my language are the limits of my world, and this is also a valuable insight in the political sphere. Thank you.
Okay. So maybe I'll take the red seats now, so they.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
I like it in the end.
It's very comfortable. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. I will be brief. Before I delve into what I plan to say, I just want to make a preliminary remark just on this panel and the bringing together of Turkey, Poland, Hungary, and Israel. And in my planned remarks, I'm going to talk about, a certain issue as if we can really talk about these four countries together. But before that, I want to make a little point about Israeli exceptionalism, in the sense that there's something
that I believe is inherently different in Israel that makes the talk of solutions much more difficult. And to understand that, I just want to say, so we focused here on legalism and the use of constitutions and of democratic procedure in a more authoritarian way. And so that's one aspect of what's going on. But another aspect of what's going on, in my view, is, and it's you can see it very strongly in Israel, is, you talked about populist democracy, majoritarian democracy. It's the very destruction of this notion of the state and its institutions being at the service of the general public. Okay, we have a descent into what the US founding fathers called factionalism. Okay, it's the institutions are grabbed by one group and it's in their service. And I think in the Israeli context, historically, both aspects, the legalism and the factionalism, have very strong roots. Okay, and that is linked, in my view, and I'm sure many of the panelists from Israel at home will necessarily agree with me, that is linked to the Jewish character of the state and the occupation, which are two linked issues. The occupation has been deeply legalized, so we have a decades, multi-decades old tradition of manipulating the law in a very formalist way to reach unjust results that have nothing to do with the way the same norms are interpreted by the international community. And we have a tradition of factionalism that has been accentuated in the past decade, amongst others, through the nation-state law, but this goes older. This goes back further, of the state being deployed in the service of the Jewish people. So I don't know enough about Turkey, Hungary, and Poland to know if there is some kind of parallel, but it seems to me there isn't. So when I'm now going to move on to talk about responses and arguments and how to address these problems. But I just want to say that there's this huge caveat as to how much in Israel these are powerful and the extent to which we should talk about them together. So I was asked to talk about democratic erosion and democracy. And so my very sort of narrow take on this is going to be on the ability of international human rights law to address this problem, this phenomenon, and just even at the level of providing a language, right, to critique and move things forward. And what I'm going to argue very briefly is that I believe international human rights law, which is my field, but unfortunately, I think it's very limited as a language to address this issue, and not for pragmatic reasons such as its famous lack of enforcement mechanisms, but more for conceptual reasons. And because it's at the conceptual level, I think what I'm going to say also applies to constitutional norms relating to human rights or just, political discussions of human rights in general. So, of course, international human rights law and human rights in general, they're a human practice. They're concepts, they can take different meanings. I'm not being essentialist here, but there are some meanings that have fossilized and that dominate the discourse. And in particular, a very individualist perspective. We have collective rights, we have fantastic developments in the past few decades, but still the field is very timid, moving away from individualism. So, and the main idea here that I want to put forward is that because of its individualist perspective and its focus on substance, international human rights law has difficulty addressing institutional, structural, technical, subtle changes of the kind that we've discussed here. And it can really step in when there are flagrant violations of principles or dramatic events, but not all these tricks, technical tricks. So I'll give as an example the ECHR case law on the judicial reforms in Poland. There are a number of very interesting cases in recent years
where the European Court of Human Rights has held Poland to be in violation of the European Convention because of its judicial reforms. But ironically, in most of these cases, the court has done this by focusing on the rights of individual judges, such as in the case of, I don't know how to pronounce this, forgive me, Saada, is that how you say it? Okay, versus Poland in 2022, which concerns the premature termination of a judge from his position on the National Council of the judiciary appointing judges. The court found a violation of Article 6 of the European Convention dealing with access to justice, referring to the individual applicant's right to access to justice that had been violated because, among other things, he did not have access to an appeal procedure, okay, to challenge this. So, of course, the discussion of the court contained extensive references to the context, to the importance of judicial independence, of the role of law, the broader background. But the doctrinal hook that really did the work of leading to the finding of an infringement of Article 6 was the judge's individual rights. And this matters in my view. It's actually dangerous because one of the populist techniques is to invert the liberal logic, right? In liberal logic, the individual has rights and has more freedom than the state. The state is subject to the principle of legality and can only interfere where it's expressly allowed to. And the technique, a popular technique used is to invert that logic and assign to the state and assign to public office holders rights and freedoms in order to justify undemocratic measures. The example from Israel, where I live, is that Netanyahu justifies not standing down from politics despite the criminal indictments and the legal process against him as deriving from his right to employment, as a right to be employed, as a member of Knesset and as the prime minister, and his right to be considered innocent until proven guilty. So, there are more collective rights that are more apt to deal with institutional applications, such as the right to self-determination. But that, again, to the extent that it's justiciable in international human rights law, such as before the African Commission on Human Rights, it's in cases of military coups. Those are the cases that are found where there's a violation found. And it seems that there's something really dramatic that has to be shown. This seems to be very limited to deal with these piecemeal institutional tricks that lead to institutional decay. There are also specific mandate holders like the Special Rapporteur on the Independence of Judges and Lawyers, the Venice Commission, and the Council of Europe that have issued very strong statements on judicial reform in Israel and elsewhere, in Poland, etc. But note that these institutions are not focused on individual rights. They're specifically, they're not classic judicial human rights institutions. They're freer to talk about institutional reforms. More generally, as Tobias Kelly has shown in his ethnography of the Committee Against Torture, the recommendations of international human rights institutions have tended to focus on institutional and legal change, okay, changing your institutions through constitutional change or legal change to look more like a liberal state. And these recommendations actually have fed into the comparative constitutional law that the bad guys do with each other, right? They say, okay, the Committee Against Torture wants us to have an institution that allows to visit prisons, or to have an independent human rights commission, or to have, so all these formal changes. It encourages a sort of formalist obsession and doesn't go down to the issues of culture. So if not the human rights discourse, of course, there are issues where protesters or political opponents are jailed, parties are banned. I'm not talking about those things. You can definitely turn there to freedom of opinion, political rights, etc. I'm talking about the actual more technical reforms. So how to address these? So there are other languages available to us, but we tend to forget about them because of the hegemony of human rights to talk about all forms of justice. So Ofra and others here as well before have suggested focusing on procedural issues. I would like to suggest for some of these piecemeal approaches, and so here, I'm sorry, but I'm referring to a piece I wrote myself with Liora Bilski, who's also here this week, a piece where we advocate addressing these piecemeal legal techniques of democratic erosion through a return to the rule of law, not in the formalist sense discussed by Michal, but in the sense described and advocated by Lon Fuller, okay, where we focus neither on the substance of the norms or the process through which norms are enacted, but on the form of law. Is the law of general application? Is it retroactive? Does it grant office holders a huge amount of discretion? Is the law ambiguous? Is it contradictory? If you look at most of the subtle reforms enacted to erode democracy, they will fail the concept of the rule of law described by Fuller, because there are tricks to cover with legal varnish what is in fact a grab, a power grab, and of discretion. So that's one solution, alongside with human rights, to talk about blatant violations of certain freedoms, focus on procedural issues. This is not to say, this is not like a critical take to say, international human rights law is responsible for all the problems here, just that it's a limited tool to address what we've been discussing here. Thanks for listening.
So you just thanks so much for this. You just destroyed the very idea of the homie, right? That there is something in common.
No, I agree. There are things in common. There are just some differences that have to be.
No, sure. But do you think that Fuller is as relevant to Poland as it is I don't know, I will definitely look at your paper, but do you think that he is as relevant to Poland as to Israel, as to Salvador or Brazil?
Well, okay, so I'm not an expert on those countries, but I have, and there, when I give a presentation about Fuller, I have examples from Poland, from Colombia, from other places where these techniques, for example, the law whereby in Poland, I believe it was in 2006, 2016, the age of retirement for judges was reduced, but discretion was granted to the Minister of Justice to remain, to leave some judges according to criteria that were not at all spelled out. So this is an example of ambiguous, unclear rules that leave, it's a trick, and you have all kinds of retroactive legislation. It's not a solution for every problem, but you can, on these technical, this manipulation of legal form, you can often find it's something that returns in other countries as well. And of course, the personal legislation, right? So the whole idea of legislation being general and not personal. So when you have rulers amending the Constitution to extend term limits or abolish them or change voting procedures to help themselves, you can look at those as a form of personal legislation, not of general application, that it's not law in the sense of the morally charged notion of law that Fuller brings us.
I see. Okay, super interesting. Remarks, questions? Yes, please. I have a couple of people regarding what people comment on the international organization. I just want to say that I completely agree. I think
recently, okay, there's so
maybe, yeah.
no.
So again?
Yeah.
I know. Yeah.
Okay. It's okay. Okay, so regarding the international, like almost a forum of autocrats, I completely agree. Recently in Turkey, for example, just before the elections, the Erdogan government submitted a constitutional amendment proposition regarding putting a definition of marriage in the constitution, whereas there's no actually any problem or like any sort of discussion to allow gay marriage in Turkey, but I assume mostly from inspiration from Russia, Hungary, they decided to include this in the electoral rhetoric, and they just submitted. They proposed a constitutional amendment for that. So I completely agree with the sense that there are examples of this from different examples on this. And regarding the remark you made about democracy being something common in both visions, I also think that's particularly important. And again, I just want to give an example from Turkey, because actually the government used legal formalism in a sense to annul the municipal elections in Istanbul in 2019. And then the reaction from the Istanbuliyot was actually giving 6 more points to the opposition candidate. So there is something actually interesting here in the sense that that democracy component that is common to both visions can sometimes work in a way to give way to the opposition, to a more pluralist democracy to some extent. And I also want to say about the I'm sorry, for international human rights law, I also completely agree with what you said, and I just want to maybe bring your attention to a recent ETHR case on the unjustly imprisoned pro-Kurdish politician Selahattin Demirtas. In that case, in Grain Chamber, actually, ECHR, without saying it explicitly, used Ayn Polder's perspective on the law and said a constitutional amendment that lifted the immunity of Mr. Demirtas is not a law. So there are actually uses even by the European Court of Human Rights that is inspired from Polder, just because it's not a general thing, because it was specifically targeting Mr. Demirtas' opposition parliamentarians. So that is to some extent is used. But I also think there is a work, I mean, there are obviously more general solutions, like perspective-based solutions, as you're saying, to international human rights law. But I also think even in the current framework, there are some things to do more about tying maybe political participation rights, focusing a bit more on political participation rights in the context of international human rights law as well. Especially in the case of ECHR, they are very not well protected. Specifically, the Article 3 of the protocol is one of the worst articles I would say in the convention regarding it's only about legislative elections, etc. So I think there's some work to do here to tie kind of like a person's rights as an elector, as a political agent in the system. And I think even with the ECHR point of view, like which is completely focused on individual applications, if we actually discuss more about the voters' rights specifically, even related to electoral systems, etc., I think there is some discussion moment that is even doing less than what you're proposing in terms of perspective change, which I agree is also necessary. So thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much. Any kind of follow-up on that now? On good. Last tiny question on I want please go, but you have to come here then.
One question about you all mentioned, both of you has mentioned the case of El Salvador, and one thing that is happening, especially in Latin America, is the discussion about monism and dualism in terms of the place or the role that the international human right play inside the constitutions, and the relationship between the constitutions and the human rights international law. And it, of course, influences a lot the way domestic courts apply the international framework. And for example, Brazil is a case that paradigmatic in the disregard of the inter-American standards of the Human Rights Commission and the Human Rights Inter-American Court. And in Argentina, for example, there was I was thinking about these examples because sometimes the changes are not so strong, but they operate at the level of interpretation. So how we should understand the international human rights law with regard to the constitution. And in Argentina, well, like there's a huge tradition of following the standards of the Inter-American Court. There was the Supreme Court has made like a statement in which they have interpreted that the Inter-American Court has a lower status with respect to the Constitution. So I think that's another strategy to of weakening the value of international human rights standards. And I was wondering what is the role of that technique in terms of softening the value of human rights law. That's
Thanks so much.
I mean, just very quickly, I mean, I think that this can be placed as part of the general backlash, which many of the governments pursuing this kind of democratic erosion, or they have a backlash against, liberalism, so including a human rights norm, international law. So you can see it as part of that backlash. But I want to say that courts giving a high value to international human rights norms and applying them from an Israeli perspective, that's not necessarily better, because then they completely, you have the Israeli Supreme Court invoking international human rights norms, in particular the European Court of Human Rights, and completely distorting it or only picking the more state favorable interpretations. So, there's no getting around the political maneuvers. Yeah, that's
after the Inter-American Convention had constitutional value after the constitutional amendment of 1994.
That the thing is that the discussion is that because the constitution says that it has like a higher status with respect to the law, but not to the constitution. So the discussion is the Supreme Court has said, well, it is higher to the law, but not higher to the constitution. So if the constitution says something different to the Inter-American Court, so it is value, we will take what our constitution say, and the constitutions in Latin America, as you probably know, have like some standards that are against the human rights standards. So in particular, with regard to the transitional justice, for example, the Inter-American Court says that amnesty laws are forbidden, but most of the countries, for example, Brazil, they say, well, yes, it is the Inter-American standard, but our constitution says something different, so we will apply another standard. So I think that's a strategy to.
Well, I just have to say on the issue of the impunity, I think that that position is much more progressive than the position in the courts. The whole criminal law term, etc. But
the discussion now is how for example, you comment how the case of El Salvador, and you know that there is like a concentration camp of thousands of prison people that are like not respecting their human rights, and now the discussion is the same, but the Inter-American human rights law does not apply for so it's really worrying for the population.
Dear all, this is all fascinating. Thank you so much for the participation. We have to stop at this point because we have been abusing of your patience anyway. So thanks so much. I think that this discussion is not over. Unfortunately, we meet next year to see the follow-up of the catastrophe all over the world. So be here, right? And if you would like to be a part of this discussion a little bit more, just get in touch with us and go on. Okay, thanks so much.